The body hit the floor before anyone heard the shot. Outside, Alaska was trying to swallow Frosthaven whole. 70-mile winds, zero visibility, a blizzard that turned the world into static. Inside the military medical center, the lights were flickering. The perimeter alarm had been screaming for 11 seconds before someone finally silenced it. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was looking at the quiet nurse in the corner and deciding she wasn't worth worrying about. Ava Quinn hadn't moved from her station, hadn't flinched at the alarm, hadn't reached for a phone or a radio or anyone else's sleeve. She had simply counted exits, shadows, the weight distribution of every man in the room who thought they were the most dangerous thing in the building. They had no idea what they had just locked themselves inside with. If this story already has you gripped, follow along with me all the way to the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The storm had been building for 3 days before it finally arrived with intention. Weather systems in the interior of Alaska didn't negotiate. They didn't warn you politely or give you time to prepare a response. They arrived like a verdict. Heavy, absolute, indifferent to whatever plans you'd made. By the evening of November 14th, the roads connecting Frosthaven Military Medical Center to the nearest civilian town had been swallowed completely. The satellite uplinks were degrading. The backup generator had kicked in twice in the last hour, and both times there had been a long-held breath second before the lights came back. Corporal Danny Reyes stood at the front desk of the medical wing and watched the windows shake in their frames. He was 23 years old, broad-shouldered, trained for hostile environments, and he was still unsettled by the sound the wind made against the reinforced glass. A high, sustained note, like something in pain. "Gonna be a long night," he said to no one in particular. "It's already been a long night," said the nurse behind the medication cart without looking up. Reyes turned. The nurse... He had to think for a second before the name came to him. Ava. Ava Quinn. She'd been assigned to Frosthaven 6 weeks ago, transferred from somewhere down south, some base medical facility in a warmer state that apparently hadn't managed to keep her busy enough. She was quiet. She did her work. She didn't socialize much with the medical staff and even less with the Marines stationed there for the joint readiness rotation. Dark hair pulled back, no makeup, no jewelry, no conversation unless it was necessary. The kind of person a room absorbed without registering. Reyes had barely spoken 10 words to her since she arrived. "You good?" he asked, mostly to fill the silence. "Fine," she said, and wheeled the cart around the corner and was gone. He watched the space where she'd been for a moment, then turned back to the windows. Hut. Frosthaven Military Medical Center wasn't a traditional forward operating base. It existed in a complicated administrative category, part research facility, part trauma unit, part classified infrastructure that nobody below a certain clearance level was encouraged to ask questions about. It occupied a sprawling complex of reinforced concrete buildings on the eastern edge of a valley that didn't appear on most civilian maps. In summer, it was remote. In winter, it was something closer to isolated. The medical wing handled routine care for the rotating Marine units, minor surgical work, and the occasional emergency medevac case when weather permitted. The research side of the facility was housed in a separate building connected by an internal corridor, and the Marines stationed there had learned early not to wonder too loudly about what went on back there. There were currently 41 people inside the complex, 19 Marines in various states of rotation, readiness, and off-duty rest. 11 medical staff, including 2 physicians, 4 nurses, 3 technicians, and a pair of administrative personnel who mostly processed paperwork and looked vaguely uncomfortable at all times. 8 research division employees whose specific functions were never discussed at group meals. And 3 patients currently admitted, 2 recovering from cold weather training injuries, 1 post-operative Marine named Staff Sergeant Harlan Briggs, who had taken a bad fall during a navigation exercise and cracked 2 ribs and his left wrist. Briggs was in room 7. He was 41 years old, built like a man who had never in his life considered the possibility of backing down from anything, and he was currently furious about being in a hospital bed. Ava had checked on him 3 times already that evening. "You don't have to keep coming back," he said when she appeared in his doorway just after 9 p.m., the storm howling against the exterior wall of his room. "I'm not going anywhere." That's why I keep coming back, she said, checking the IV drip without ceremony. You said that same thing 2 hours ago, and then I found you trying to do push-ups. One push-up, with a cracked rib. Barely cracked. She wrote something on his chart and looked at him steadily. There was something in her eyes that Briggs, who had spent his career learning to read people quickly and accurately, found genuinely difficult to categorize. Not warmth, exactly. Not coldness. Something more like assessment, like she was doing a calculation he couldn't see the variables of. Sleep, she said. I don't like this storm, Briggs said. It came out differently than he intended, less like complaint and more like a man who trusted his instincts and was currently paying attention to one of them. Ava paused at the door. No, she said simply. Neither do I. She left before he could respond to that. At 9:47 p.m., the perimeter alarm activated for the first time. It was a brief pulse, 3 seconds, then silence. The duty officer, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, immediately pulled up the exterior camera feeds and saw nothing but white. The blizzard had reduced visibility to essentially zero. The cameras were registering movement because the storm itself was moving, a wall of snow and wind that the sensors couldn't distinguish from human activity. Ghost reading, said Corporal Tasha Okafor from the monitoring station. Third one today. The system's overcalibrated for weather like this. Webb stared at the screens for another moment. Log it. Keep eyes on. Yes, sir. He walked away from the station, and that was their first mistake. Not the dismissal itself, but the certainty that came with it. The assumption that the storm was the only thing moving out there. In the medication room off the south corridor, Ava heard the alarm activate and heard it cut off. She set down the inventory clipboard she'd been holding and stood very still for a moment. Then she finished the count, replaced the clipboard, and walked to the single small window at the end of the corridor. She couldn't see anything through it. The glass was a solid white rectangle, the world beyond it erased entirely. She stood there for 45 seconds. Then she went back to work, and her movements were slightly different than they had been before. More deliberate, more economical, like a person who has quietly shifted from one kind of readiness to another. The second alarm came at 10:23 p.m. This time it lasted 8 seconds, and when it cut off, 3 of the exterior motion sensors on the north perimeter registered a simultaneous anomaly that the system logged as equipment interference and automatically flagged as non-critical. Lieutenant Webb was in the break room drinking bad coffee when Okafor reached him on the radio. Sir, we've got a multi-sensor hit on the north side. Could still be weather artifact, but the pattern's a little what? A pause. Organized, sir. I know that sounds... Get Reyes and put 2 men on the north corridor entrance. Probably nothing. Let's confirm it's nothing. Copy. Webb set down his coffee and went back to the monitoring station. He looked at the sensor logs, at the camera feeds showing nothing but impenetrable white. He pulled up the timestamp data on the anomaly and stared at the 3-point simultaneous hit. Organized. He didn't like that word. Okafor, get me a line to the perimeter exterior. The lights went out. They came back on in 1.4 seconds on backup power. The fluorescent overheads replaced by the slightly yellowed emergency lighting that painted everything in a color that looked faintly like old bruises. In that 1.4 seconds, in the sudden cavity of absolute darkness, something happened that the cameras didn't capture and no one was positioned to see. The north corridor entrance was breached. They came in through a maintenance access point that was theoretically known only to facility engineering staff and, apparently, to whoever had spent time studying the schematics of Frosthaven Medical with considerable patience. 4 of them first, moving in practice 2-in-2 formation, dressed in cold weather gear that was mil-spec quality and completely unmarked. They cleared the entrance corridor in 18 seconds. By the time Reyes and his 2-man response reached the North Hall, the intruders had already established a choke point at the junction with the main medical wing. The first shot cracked through the building like something had broken at the structural level. Reyes dove behind the nurse's station desk and pulled his radio. Contact North Junction. We have armed personnel inside the wire. Multiple contacts, North Junction, requesting... The radio crackled and died. Electronic interference, precise and deliberate, the kind you needed specific equipment to generate. Fall back, someone was shouting. Get the civilians back, get the patients. The nurse, Reyes heard someone yell. One of the other Marines, voice ratcheted high with adrenaline. "Where's the nurse? Get Quinn out of—" He looked toward the south corridor. Ava Quinn was gone. What the Marines understood in that moment, and what would take considerably longer to fully process, was that there was a specific species of fear that comes not from what you can see, but from what you cannot account for. They were trained men in a crisis, responding with the tools and instincts they'd built over years of preparation, and within the first 4 minutes of the breach, they had established that they were dealing with a coordinated incursion of at least 7 hostiles, possibly more, armed with suppressed weapons and operating with intelligence about the facility's layout. What they could not account for was the sound, or rather, the absence of sound, from the East Wing. The first hostile had gone dark at 10:26 p.m. He had been positioned at the junction of the East Utility Corridor and the main supply route, covering his team's flank, and then at a certain point he simply wasn't on comms anymore. His team registered his silence and assumed radio interference. They sent no one to check. The second hostile went dark at 10:29 p.m. He had been moving toward the research wing access corridor, which was the likely objective. Whatever was back there was what they'd come for. He was good at his job. He was careful, experienced, and he was operating in low visibility with equipment that should have given him every advantage in a building full of medical staff and scattered soldiers. He turned a corner in the dim emergency lighting and encountered something that his training had not prepared him for. He didn't make a sound. In room 7, Staff Sergeant Harlan Briggs lay in his hospital bed with his cracked ribs and his cracked wrist and his very functional ears, and he listened to the building with the focused attention of a man who had spent 22 years staying alive in complicated situations. He heard the breach. He heard the radio calls cut off. He heard the reduced, muffled quality of the firefight developing in the North Wing, suppressed weapons, meaning professionals, and he made several rapid calculations about his own circumstances. He was in a hospital bed. His dominant hand was in a partial cast. He had no weapon. He could not run at full capacity. What he could do was think. And what he was thinking was that this attack had the shape of something he'd seen before, not in execution, but in intention. Too precise, too knowledgeable about the facility, too well timed with the storm conditions. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned, which meant someone had fed them intelligence, which meant they had a specific target. He was still working through the implications of this when his room door opened quietly and Ava Quinn stepped inside, closing it behind her. She was carrying a trauma bag and a weapon that Briggs recognized as a suppressed M18 variant that had absolutely no business being in a nurse's possession. "You're going to have a lot of questions," she said. "Starting with that," Briggs confirmed, looking at the firearm. "Later." She moved to his IV line, adjusted something with quick efficiency, and looked at him directly. "Can you walk?" "I can move." "That's not the same thing." "No," he said, "but for tonight, it'll have to be." She looked at him for a half second with that same unreadable calculus in her eyes, then nodded once. "Stay low, stay behind me. Don't try to be a hero unless I specifically ask you to be. Clear?" Briggs, who had never in his life taken orders from someone in scrubs, heard himself say, "Clear. Get." The third hostile went dark at 10:33 p.m. By then, Lieutenant Webb had consolidated his available Marines into a defensive position at the central hub of the medical wing, 4 men, 2 wounded, and was operating on the assumption that they were holding until a rescue signal could be sent. The electronic interference was comprehensive, killing all standard radio frequencies, but the facility had a hardwired emergency uplink buried in the communications room that wasn't wireless and therefore couldn't be jammed. Getting to it was the problem. It was on the other side of the North Corridor, which was currently occupied. "We need to push through," said Corporal Okafor, who was bleeding from a graze on her left forearm and seemed mostly angry about it. "We push through into a choke point with 4 shooters. We lose people," Webb said. "We stay here. We lose the facility." "I'm aware." He looked at the corridor. He looked at his men. He did the arithmetic. "Give me a better option." Nobody had one. What happened next did not begin with a plan from Webb or a charge from his Marines. It began with the sound of something in the North Corridor, a brief, specific sequence of sounds that none of them could immediately interpret, and then a silence, and then a voice on the hostile team's frequency, in the clear, that said 3 words in a tone of controlled disbelief before cutting off entirely. And then nothing. From 4 armed professionals in a secured choke point, nothing. Webb looked at Okafor. Okafor looked at Webb. "What was that?" someone said. Nobody answered. Webb made a decision. "On me. Move." They moved into the north corridor and found what the hostiles had left behind, which was to say, the hostiles themselves, all 4 of them, and the evidence of a sequence of events that had occurred in under 90 seconds with what could only be described as clinical efficiency. No wasted action, no collateral damage. Specific, deliberate, complete. "Oh," said one of Webb's Marines, a young corporal named Preston, who had been doing this job for 2 years and had never, until this moment, been rendered genuinely speechless by something he'd found in a corridor. Webb stood in the middle of the North Junction and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with the Alaskan temperature outside and everything to do with the distance between what he'd understood about this situation 60 seconds ago and what he understood about it now. "Who did this?" he said quietly. From the far end of the corridor, a figure stepped into the edge of the emergency lighting. Ava Quinn, in scrubs, with Briggs moving carefully behind her and a weapon held with the kind of relaxed, absolute confidence that you either were born with or earned in circumstances Webb didn't want to imagine. "North Wing is clear," she said. "You have 3 more in the east corridor and 2 trying to breach the research access. I need 2 of your people to hold this position, and I need the rest with me in the next 45 seconds. Webb stared at her. "Lieutenant?" she said, and there was nothing unkind in her voice, but there was also nothing that resembled a request. 45 seconds. He moved. The research wing access corridor was the endgame of whatever had been planned for Frosthaven that night. The 2 hostiles attempting to breach it were the most experienced of the group. The point element, the specialists, the ones trusted with the actual objective. They had watched their team's communications go dark one by one, with the methodical progression of something systematic, and they had not stopped moving because stopping was not an option. Whatever they were after was on the other side of that door, and they had not come this far through a blizzard and an infiltration and the silence of 6 teammates going offline to stop 40 meters short of the finish. The lead operative, a man who had worked under 4 different contract flags in 11 years and had never once been caught by anything he hadn't accounted for, reached the access panel and began the breach sequence. He was good. He was fast. He would have had it open in under a minute. He had approximately 8 seconds of that minute remaining when Ava Quinn came around the corner. What happened in the research wing corridor in the next 30 seconds was not witnessed by Webb's Marines, who had responded to the East Corridor threat and were occupied there. It was witnessed only by Briggs, who was positioned at the corridor entrance per instruction, and who watched with the expression of a man comprehensively revising his understanding of the world. He would later describe it to exactly 3 people who had the clearance to hear it as the most precise thing he had ever seen a human being do. Not violent, exactly. Or not only violent, more like a problem being solved. A sequence of variables being addressed in optimal order with 0 redundancy. When it was done, Ava straightened, looked at the 2 men on the floor, and turned to find Briggs watching her from the entrance. "You're bleeding," he said, a graze on her right shoulder, visible through a tear in her scrub top. "I know," she said. "You need someone to look at. I'll look at it myself." She walked past him toward the central hub, and her voice was completely even. "Tell Webb the East Corridor is clear. The facility is secured. Tell him to attempt the hardwired uplink." She paused. "He'll need to report this." "Who do I tell him to report to?" Briggs asked. Ava Quinn reached the end of the corridor and turned back to look at him. And in the yellowed emergency lighting of a blizzard-locked military medical center in the middle of the Alaskan dark, she looked like something the storm had brought in, patient and permanent, and entirely unconcerned with what anyone in this building thought of her. "He'll know," she said, "when they answer." She walked around the corner and was gone. Briggs stood in the corridor for a long moment. His ribs hurt. His wrist hurt. He was standing in the aftermath of something he didn't have language for yet. Down the hall, the hardwired uplink activated, Webb's voice, taut and controlled, reporting the situation. And then the answer came back. Not from the regional command frequency, not from the standard chain of contact, but from a classification tier that made Webb go very still and very quiet on the other end of the line. A tier that Briggs, with his 22 years and his considerable experience, had heard referenced only once before, in a briefing that had been immediately classified and never discussed again. He looked at the door that Ava Quinn had just disappeared through. Outside, the blizzard was still screaming. The lights were still on backup power. 11 people in the facility needed medical attention ranging from minor to serious, and the woman who had just secured the building from a coordinated armed infiltration was presumably currently assessing her own shoulder wound in the same quiet, efficient way she did everything. In 40 minutes, the extraction helicopter would break through the storm ceiling. And when it landed, when the figures in unmarked cold weather gear stepped out and moved through the facility with the specific authority of people who answered to no local command, they would go directly, without hesitation, to the south wing, where Ava Quinn would be waiting. Not surprised, not relieved, not in need of rescue, just waiting, with the patient, contained expression of someone who had never, not for a single moment that night, lost control of the situation. Briggs pressed his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. The building had 12 hostile intruders when the night began. It had 0 now, and the woman the Marines had been trying to protect, the quiet nurse, the invisible one, the one nobody had looked at twice in 6 weeks, was the reason they were all still breathing. He heard footsteps. Steady, unhurried. Her footsteps, coming back down the south corridor toward the hub. And Briggs, Staff Sergeant Harlan Briggs, 22 years in, twice decorated, a man who had stood in a lot of rooms with a lot of dangerous people and always been among the most dangerous. Briggs straightened up and, without thinking about it, stood a little straighter. The door at the end of the corridor opened. Outside, something changed in the sound of the storm. A different frequency cutting through the wind, mechanical and precise, growing louder by the second. The helicopter. It was early. The helicopter was early, and that meant someone had been watching. Not the base, not the regional command center patched in through the hardwired uplink. Someone further up the chain, someone who had been monitoring Frosthaven from a distance the entire night, waiting for a specific signal that had nothing to do with the distress call Webb had just transmitted. Because you didn't scramble a classified extraction asset through a 70-mile blizzard in under 40 minutes based on a routine breach report. You did it because you already knew what had happened, because you'd been positioned to respond the moment the situation resolved. Briggs understood this as the sound of the rotors grew from a distant mechanical pulse to something that filled the building, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through the bones of everyone still standing inside Frosthaven Medical. He understood it the way a career soldier understands things, not with analysis, but with the gut-level recognition of a pattern he'd seen before, in different shapes, in different theaters, always meaning the same fundamental thing. Someone had been running a play that nobody else knew was on the board. Ava Quinn came through the door at the end of the south corridor and walked toward the central hub with her shoulder wound dressed, neatly, efficiently, the way you dressed a wound when you'd done it alone dozens of times before, and had stopped finding it remarkable. She held a tablet in her left hand, something she'd retrieved from somewhere, and she was reading it with the focused calm of a person reviewing quarterly reports rather than the immediate aftermath of a 12-person armed infiltration. Webb was standing in the central hub with 4 of his Marines, his face carrying the expression of a man who had walked through a door expecting a room and found a continent on the other side. He watched Ava approach and opened his mouth. "Don't," she said, without looking up from the tablet. "Quinn, Lieutenant." She stopped, looked at him directly. "The people on that helicopter will answer every question you currently have. Give them your full report. Give them everything your people experienced tonight. Be accurate and thorough. That's the most useful thing you can do in the next 20 minutes. Can you do that?" Webb looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who was easily managed. He was smart, experienced, and genuinely pissed off, and those were not small things. But he was also, at his core, a soldier, which meant he understood chain of command in a way that went deeper than institutional training. It lived in him at the cellular level, and whatever the chain was that Ava Quinn operated within, it was above him. He could feel that the way you felt a change in air pressure, without evidence, without explanation, as a simple fact of the environment. "Fine," he said flatly, "but when this is over, she said, returning to the tablet. "I'll answer the questions I'm authorized to answer." She paused. "Some of them will surprise you." The rotors were everything now, the sound swallowing the storm itself, and then the lights through the reinforced windows shifted, the helicopter's spotlights cutting through the blizzard at an angle that turned the whiteout outside into something briefly visible, a world of blue-white snow and dark shapes moving through it with the practiced efficiency of people who had done exactly this in exactly these conditions more times than they could count. 6 of them came through the main entrance, and the way they moved through the building told Briggs everything he needed to know about who they were before anyone showed a credential. Former special operations at minimum, current status classified in a way that meant they didn't wear their affiliations on their gear. They swept the building in under 3 minutes, not because they didn't trust the situation, but because that was procedure. And people who operated at this level didn't cut procedural corners even when the evidence suggested they were unnecessary. The last one through the door was not a soldier. She was in her mid-50s, compact, with silver-streaked hair cut close, and the kind of posture that came from decades of absolute certainty about one's position in every room one entered. She wore cold-weather gear like the rest, but on her it looked like a suit. She carried nothing except a phone and a look that had long since finished deciding how it felt about the world. Her name, Briggs would later learn, was Deputy Director Sylvia Crane. She walked into the central hub, looked briefly at Webb's assembled Marines, looked at the evidence of the night's events with the expression of someone reviewing expected results, and then looked at Ava Quinn. "Clean?" she said. 12 engagements, 12 contained," Ava replied. 3 are still viable for interrogation. The others weren't an option by the time I reached them. "Research wing? Unbreached. The target is secure." Crane nodded once, with the satisfied efficiency of a person checking items off a list that had been running in her head for hours. Then she looked at the room, at Webb, at Briggs propped against the wall, at Okafor and Preston and the others, and she assessed them the way Ava did, with that same rapid arithmetic, though hers had a different quality. Less operational, more political. "These people need a debrief and a reason," she said to Ava. "They need the truth," Briggs said from his position against the wall. Crane looked at him. She read his rank, his name tape, his 22 years of bearing, and she recalibrated slightly. "Staff Sergeant." "He was awake for most of it," Ava said. "He has context." "That makes him useful," Crane said, and there was something that wasn't quite warmth but was adjacent to respect in her voice. "And complicated." "That's generally what happens," Ava said, "when people pay attention." What followed was not a debrief in the traditional sense. It was more like a controlled demolition of everything the people in that room had thought they understood about the last 6 weeks. Crane didn't perform it. She didn't stand in front of Webb's Marines with a slideshow and a narrative arc. She was too practical for theater, too time-pressured for anything that wasn't essential. She told them what they needed to know in the order they needed to know it. And she did it with the particular skill of someone who had spent a career distinguishing between classified information and actionable information, and understanding that the overlap was always smaller than people expected. The facility at Frosthaven was not purely a medical center. That much was obvious. The research wing existed in a classification category that Webb's rotation didn't have access to, and tonight's incursion had been specifically targeted at something housed there. Something that a network of organized smugglers with military-grade equipment and detailed facility intelligence had decided was worth the risk of a blizzard insertion. They had been wrong, but not because the facility's defenses had stopped them, because of what had been placed inside the facility 6 weeks ago. Quinn was inserted as medical staff as part of a counterintelligence operation that's been running for 4 months, Crane said, and watched the room absorb that. She let the silence last exactly as long as it needed to. "The network that hit you tonight, call them the Meridian Group, that's the operational name, they've been working a long game, identifying targets inside military infrastructure, building inside intelligence, positioning assets. We identified the pattern 8 months ago and spent 4 months building the counter." She looked at Ava. She was the counter. Webb was quiet for a moment, then, "You knew they were going to hit us." "We assessed it as highly probable," Crane said. "We didn't know when. We didn't know the specific operational timeline. The blizzard was their cover, and it was good. They timed it to degrade our response capacity." You used us," Webb said, and his voice was level, but there was something hot underneath it. You put civilians in this building, patients, medical staff, and you use this facility as bait. We put the most effective asset we have in a position where she could prevent exactly what happened tonight from being significantly worse, Crane replied. And she didn't flinch from Webb's anger or try to soften it. Every person in this building is alive, Lieutenant. Every person. The research wing is intact. The Meridian network is fractured. I understand you're angry. I also understand that anger is a reasonable response to being told you were part of an operation you didn't know about. She paused. I'm not going to apologize for the operation. I will tell you that its outcome was the best possible one. Could have told us, Okafor said from the back of the room. Her arm was bandaged now, her voice flat. Could have told us what to expect. Could have, Crane agreed. And the moment we disclosed the operation to anyone outside a very specific clearance tier, we risked it reaching the people we were watching. The Meridian network had inside intelligence on this facility. That means they had a source. If that source detected even a shift in operational posture here, anything that suggested the facility was prepared, the window closed. The network went dark. And we started over, with them still intact and still operating. She let that land. We didn't have that option. The room processed this. Briggs, from his position against the wall, watched each face do its own version of the calculation, weighing anger against outcome, instinct against logic, the very human desire to have been trusted against the very real fact that they were all still alive to feel that desire. Preston, the young corporal who hadn't spoken since the corridor, looked at Ava. So everything, the 6 weeks, none of it was real? Ava looked at him. She'd been mostly quiet through Crane's explanation, standing slightly apart from it, neither adding to it nor distancing herself from it. The nursing was real, she said. I'm a licensed RN. Have been for 9 years. A brief pause. It's a useful thing to be. That's not what I meant, Preston said. I know. She didn't look away from him. The answer is complicated. Some of what you knew about me was a cover. Some of it was just me. Those things aren't always easy to separate. Preston absorbed this, nodded slowly. He was 23 years old, and he was doing a creditable job of updating his understanding of the world in real time, which Briggs noted and respected. The source, Webb said, returning to the thing that mattered most to him operationally. The inside intelligence. Who was it? Crane looked at him steadily. That's being addressed. That's not an answer. It's the answer you have clearance for right now, she said. By morning, it'll be a different conversation. The 3 surviving members of the Meridian insertion team were secured in separate rooms on the East Wing, each with one of Crane's people stationed outside and a very clear set of instructions about what constituted appropriate interaction until the forensic interrogation team arrived, which Crane estimated at 6 hours, give or take the weather. They were alive because Ava had made specific decisions about specific people in specific moments, based on calculations that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with intelligence value. The man in the first room was the most useful of the 3. His name, confirmed through biometric processing by one of Crane's team within 20 minutes of the helicopter landing, was Victor Sale, a Czech national with a history in private military contracting that stretched back 12 years across 4 continents and included several incidents that various governments had decided not to officially acknowledge. He was 44 years old, built for endurance rather than spectacle, and he was currently seated in a facility room chair with his wrists secured and an expression that had gone through shock, recalibration, and arrived at something that looked, grudgingly, like professional acknowledgement. He knew what had happened. He'd felt it happening in real time as his team went dark one by one. He'd tried to adapt his approach, revised his extraction strategy twice in the field, and still ended up exactly here. A man like Sale didn't indulge in self-pity about such things. He cataloged them. He filed them for future reference, in the unlikely event there was a future in which reference was useful. What he hadn't expected, what none of them had expected, was her. He'd been briefed on Frosthaven's security. He'd been given detailed intelligence on the marine rotation, their response protocols, their communication architecture, their tactical limitations in severe weather. He'd been given personnel files on every staff member in the facility, cross-referenced against military records, contractors, known operatives. Everything had checked out. Everything had been accounted for. Ava Quinn's file had described a 31-year-old registered nurse from Phoenix, Arizona, with 8 years of medical experience, no military background beyond a brief stint as a civilian contractor at a small Army base in Georgia, and no indicators of anything beyond her stated qualifications. Clean, unremarkable, invisible. The file was a masterwork. Whoever had built it had understood exactly how professional intelligence analysts verify cover identities, what they look for, what they consider sufficient, what they dismiss as noise, and had constructed something that answered every question in exactly the right way. Not perfectly clean because perfectly clean was suspicious, the right amount of history, the right kind of gaps, the right texture of an ordinary life. Seal thought about this as he sat in the room and listened to the building settle around him. He thought about it the way he thought about everything that had gone wrong tonight, as information, as something to understand. He heard footsteps in the corridor, specific footsteps with a specific cadence that he recognized even though he'd only heard them once in a very different context. The door opened. Ava Quinn stood in the doorway. She'd changed out of the torn scrub top into a clean one. Her shoulder was bandaged under it, a slight asymmetry in the fabric, the only visible indication that anything had happened to her at all. She was holding 2 cups of coffee, and she held one out to him with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who understood that basic human provision was a more effective interrogation precursor than most of what they taught in institutional settings. Sale looked at the coffee, then at her. "The file was exceptionally built," he said. "It was," she agreed. She pulled the chair from the corner, set it 3 feet from him, sat down with her own coffee. "Took 8 months. The inside source gave us the personnel files 3 months ago. We had time to work them. I know, the files you received were real, and except for one." Sale was quiet for a moment. "You knew we had the source. We identified the leak 11 weeks ago." She drank her coffee. "We let it run." He looked at her with the expression of a chess player who has just understood, retroactively, the depth of the gambit deployed against him. "The source was feeding you our requests. You knew exactly what we needed to believe to commit to the operation. We knew what you'd be looking for in the personnel files. We knew how your analyst would verify them. We built the one identity that would be assessed as zero threat." A brief pause. "It took some work." "Evidently," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost rueful. Not remorse. Men like Sale didn't arrive at remorse through professional failure, but a kind of honest acknowledgement that he had been outplayed comprehensively, from the beginning, by people who had understood his playbook better than he had. "The source," he said. "They're being collected tonight." "They were collected 40 minutes ago," she said. Seal absorbed this with the stillness of someone who has accepted that the full shape of the evening has emerged, and it is exactly as bad as it appeared to be. "What do you need from me?" "Everything above your pay grade," she said. "Names, routes, the Meridian command structure above the insertion team level. You know how this works. The more useful you are, the more the next few years resemble something survivable." "And if I'm not useful?" She drank her coffee. She didn't threaten him. She didn't outline consequences. She just looked at him with those eyes that had been calculating since before anyone in this building knew there was anything to calculate. And Sale, who had interviewed many people in his career and been interviewed by many more, understood that the absence of a threat was itself the most precise kind of communication. "I'll be useful," he said. "Good." She stood, picked up her chair, returned it to the corner. "Someone will be in at 6 a.m. She moved toward the door and then paused, hand on the frame, without turning back. "The file. You thought I was a nurse from Phoenix." "Yes." "I've never been to Phoenix," she said. "I thought you should know that." She walked out, and Sale sat in the room with his coffee going cold, and the kind of silence that follows a very complete defeat. By 2 in the morning, the worst of the blizzard had passed its peak and was beginning, slowly and grudgingly, to relent. The wind dropped from screaming to howling and then, in increments, to something that merely sounded hostile rather than apocalyptic. The snow continued, but without the frenzy of earlier. It fell now with the indifferent patience of a system that had made its point and was finishing its sentence. Inside Frosthaven, the immediate operational aftermath was giving way to the longer, quieter work of assessment. Crane's team was processing the facility, collecting evidence, documenting the engagement sites with the methodical thoroughness of people who understood that this would eventually become a record somewhere, and records needed to be clean. Webb's Marines had been organized into a rotation. Those physically able to stand watch did so. Those who needed medical attention received it, and everyone existed in the particular suspended state that follows high-intensity trauma when the adrenaline has metabolized but the mind hasn't yet found its footing again. Ava was in the medical bay working, not on herself. Her shoulder had been properly cleaned and redressed by one of the other nurses, a young woman named Greta Solis, who had spent most of the night locked in the supply room per emergency protocol and was now moving through the building with the careful, deliberate energy of someone who was holding it together through professional focus and would probably have a very significant response to the evening later, in private, when she allowed herself to. Ava had been direct with her, clear about what she needed, what didn't need to happen, what the priority order was. Solis was competent, she was scared, she was shaken, and she was competent, and in Ava's experience, those three things were not mutually exclusive. "The graze is clean," Solis said, finishing the second layer of dressing. "You were lucky." "I was positioned correctly," Ava said. Solis paused. "Is that different?" Ava considered this with what seemed like genuine thought rather than deflection. "Sometimes," she said. "Tonight, yes." Solis disposed of the used materials, stripped her gloves. She stood for a moment, not quite ready to leave. Ava watched her, the question forming, the uncertainty about whether to ask it, the eventual decision. "Were we in danger?" Solis asked. "The staff, the patients. Were we actually—" "The objective was the research wing," Ava said. "The Meridian team was not authorized by their command to engage medical non-combatants unless necessary. That's not mercy. It's operational protocol. Witnesses create complications." She looked at Solis steadily. "That said, in a breach scenario, protocol degrades as variables change, which is why getting you into the supply room was the priority." Solis absorbed this. "Not exactly reassuring." "No," Ava agreed, "but it's accurate. And I think you'd rather have accurate." Solis thought about this, nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. "I think I would." She pulled her jacket on. "You're a strange person to have around, Quinn." "I know." "I mean that as a compliment." Ava looked at her, and something in her expression shifted very slightly. Not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one, a small relaxation in the set of her features that suggested she'd received it correctly. "I know that too," she said. Solis left. Ava sat in the medical bay for a moment, alone, and the noise and motion of the facility flowed around her without touching her. She looked at her hands, clean, still, positioned in her lap with the absolute calm of someone who had passed through a great deal of violence in a short period of time, and was now in the process of filing it away in whatever internal architecture allowed her to function at this level of operational tempo. From the doorway, Briggs watched her. He'd found his way here 20 minutes ago, moving carefully on his damaged ribs, and he'd stood in the hall long enough to observe that she was alone and that she wasn't reviewing any tablet, wasn't on any communication device, wasn't doing anything productive, just sitting. He understood this as something that needed to happen, the brief, necessary pause between phases, and he understood it because he'd needed his own versions of it over 22 years. "You going to stand there all night?" she said without turning. "Or are you going to come in?" He came in. He sat carefully in the chair across from her, the one that patients normally occupied, the one that was at a deliberate angle that said, "I am not confronting you. I am simply present." And he said nothing for a moment because sometimes the best contribution was silence. "How long have you been in?" he asked finally. "Operational work? 7 years." She looked at him. "I was recruited out of my nursing program. Someone was watching for specific profiles, medical background, particular aptitude sets, certain psychological indicators. The nursing wasn't a cover to build a career in. The nursing was the reason I was recruited. Because they needed someone who could do both. Because the kind of work I do, deep placement, long duration cover, requires someone who can genuinely fulfill the stated role. You can't fake 8 hours of nursing a shift. You have to actually know how to do it." She paused. "I'm good at both things. That's not common." Briggs turned this over. 6 weeks in this facility, knowing what was coming, waiting for it. It wasn't 6 weeks of waiting. There was a lot of work in those 6 weeks, building understanding of the facility, the personnel, the research wing security architecture, identifying where the insertion would likely come and when. A pause. Also actual nursing. The work doesn't stop because the other thing is happening. Briggs, he said quietly. The push-up, the one push-up. I noticed, she said. I know you noticed. I watched you clock every person in that room the first time you walked into it. He looked at her. That's not a nursing skill. No, she agreed. It's not. There was a pause. Outside, the wind had dropped another register. The building was quieter than it had been all night, the particular quiet that comes after extremity. Heavy, textured, not peaceful exactly, but settled. You scared? Briggs asked. Ava looked at him. She considered the question with the same honest attention she gave everything. I don't experience it the way most people describe, she said. There's a heightening, or clarity, speed, physical response. But the paralysis component, the thing that shuts people down, I trained it out of myself a long time ago. She paused. Sometimes I think I trained out too much. And then I think that might be exactly what makes this possible. Briggs nodded. He'd known people like this. Not many, but a few. People who had moved something important in themselves to a place where it couldn't interfere with the work, and who had done it so completely that they couldn't entirely move it back afterward. He didn't think of it as a loss, exactly. He thought of it as a trade. Every person who operated at the level she operated at had made some version of that trade. The source, he said. The inside leak. Ava looked at him. You said they were collected 40 minutes ago, he said. I heard you tell Sale. Yes. Someone in this facility fed the Meridian Network their intelligence. Yes. And you knew who it was 11 weeks ago, and you let them keep running. Correct. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. He went through the personnel of the facility in his head, medical staff, research division, the administrative pair, his own Marines. He ran it the way he'd been taught to run it, setting aside personal reaction, filtering for behavioral indicators, opportunity windows, access levels. Research division, he said. Ava said nothing. Someone in the 8, high enough access to get the personnel files, low enough visibility that a regular security audit wouldn't catch the anomaly. Still nothing. Quinn. She looked at him with the expression she'd had in his room when he'd asked about the storm. Patient, evaluating, giving him the space to arrive somewhere under his own power. Tell me I'm wrong, he said. I can't tell you that, she said quietly. Briggs breathed out slowly. Who? That information becomes relevant to you in about 4 hours, she said, when Crane's team completes the collection protocol and the chain of notification gets activated. It's relevant to me now, he said. I've had people in this building for 3 months. I'm responsible for... I know what you're responsible for, she said, and her voice had that quality again, not unkind, but absolutely firm. The quality of a boundary that existed for reasons that weren't personal. And I'm telling you that waiting 4 hours will give you the full picture rather than the half of it that's available right now. The half of it will make you angry. The full picture will let you be effective. She met his eyes. I need you to be effective, not angry. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair slowly, favoring his ribs, and stared at the ceiling. You've been running me too, he said. Not the same way, but from the moment you walked into my room tonight, you've been managing what I know and when I know it. Yes, she said. No apology in it. No performance of guilt. Just the clean acknowledgement. You're good at it, he said. I know. That's also not a nursing skill. No, she agreed. That one I came with. At 4:17 a.m., one of Crane's team members came to find Ava in the medical bay. The message was brief. Crane wanted her in the command room, which had been temporarily established in the facility administrator's office on the 2nd floor. Briggs watched her go, and then sat alone in the medical bay for a while, thinking about trades. The command room was orderly, deliberately so, in the way that Crane established order in temporary spaces. Not comfort, not permanence, but the clear architecture of working authority. 3 of her team were at the table with laptops. The communication equipment they'd brought in was running continuous encrypted traffic. A screen on the wall showed a map Briggs wouldn't have clearance to see, which was fine because Briggs wasn't in the room. Crane was standing at the window when Ava entered, looking out at the fading blizzard, and she turned with the expression of someone whose accounting is running and who has found, unexpectedly, that the balance is slightly better than projected. "Sale is talking," she said. "I thought he might." Ava sat at the table. "He's practical. The names he's given us in the last 2 hours have already activated 3 separate operational threads. The Meridian network is significantly deeper than the structural model predicted." Crane paused. "Significantly." Ava absorbed this. "How deep?" "Deep enough that tonight wasn't the operation. Tonight was a step in an operation." Crane moved to the table, sat opposite her. "What they were after in the research wing. The material is part of a larger acquisition plan. Frosthaven was one of 4 targets. The others are in different stages of timeline." Ava was quiet for a moment. "Are the other facilities flagged?" "Being notified now, but the network moves fast when it feels pressure, and they're going to feel pressure from tonight within hours." Crane looked at her steadily. "Which means the window on the other targets is compressing." Ava understood where this was going. She'd understood it from the second sentence, probably, but she let it develop at its own pace because the specifics mattered. The 3 other targets. 1 in Norway, 1 in South Korea, 1 in New Mexico. Placement timelines. Norway and South Korea already have assets in position. New Mexico. Crane paused. New Mexico was scheduled for the next rotation cycle. We have a 30-day window that just became, based on what Sale told us, more like 72 hours. The room was very quiet. Outside, snow fell without ambition. "There's an existing cover," Crane continued. "Medical staff assignment, government facility, similar profile to this one. It was built for the next cycle. We can activate it now." She looked at Ava without apology and without softening. "You're the only asset with the specific cross-competency profile that the New Mexico target requires." Ava looked at her hands, flat on the table. She looked at them for a moment that was longer than a processing pause and shorter than hesitation. The specific duration of a person who already knows the answer and is simply taking the time to acknowledge, privately, what it costs. "What's the facility?" she said. "Kestrel Ridge, DoD-affiliated research installation, civilian medical staff cover, 43 personnel. The Meridian contact there is..." Crane slid a folder across the table and Ava opened it and read the first page. She read the second page. Something in her expression changed in a way that was very small and very significant. "You know the name," Crane said. Ava closed the folder. She sat for a moment. "From before," she said, and her voice was exactly the same as it always was. But something underneath it was different, like a note that's been transposed a half step and still sounds like music but carries a different weight. "From before," Crane confirmed and watched her. The room held the specific silence of a decision that has essentially already been made, being formally confirmed by someone who wants to arrive at it correctly. Ava put her hand on the folder. "Activation timeline?" "Wheels up in 6 hours," Crane said. "If you say yes." The blizzard outside made one last effort. A gust that rattled the windows, threw a curtain of snow against the glass, filled the room with the sound of a world still insisting on its own violence. And then it subsided. The quiet that followed was the first genuine quiet Frosthaven had experienced in 3 days. Ava Quinn looked at the folder under her hand. She thought about a name she hadn't spoken in 2 years, written on the second page in black ink, attached to a file that described a person she'd known when she was someone else. She thought about the facility in New Mexico and the 72-hour window and the lives attached to both, as lives were always attached to these things. Invisibly, until they weren't. 6 hours, she said. "I'll need the full target package by Wheels Up." Crane nodded. "It'll be ready." Ava stood. She picked up the folder, tucked it under her arm, moved toward the door. "Quinn," Crane said. She stopped. "The name in the file," Crane said carefully. "Does it change your operational assessment?" A pause. 1 beat, 2. "It changes everything except the answer," Ava said. She walked out, and the door closed behind her. And in the command room, Crane looked at the closed door for a moment longer than strictly necessary before turning back to the work that needed doing. Down the hall, down the stairs, through the still and damaged corridors of Frosthaven Medical Center, where the evidence of the night's violence was in the process of being systematically documented and removed, Ava Quinn moved with the same steady, unhurried pace she always had. She passed the room where Sale was providing his information. She passed the North Junction where Webb's Marines had held. She passed the door to room 7, from behind which she could hear the slow, careful breathing of a man who had trusted his instincts about the storm and been right about all of it. She stopped outside room 7. She stood there for a moment that no one witnessed. Then she went to prepare for New Mexico. Behind her, at the end of the corridor, one of Crane's team members was finishing the documentation of the last engagement site. He was thorough, professional, detail-oriented. He photographed everything, cataloged everything, bagged and tagged everything with the systematic care of someone who understood that evidence was only useful if it was complete. He was almost done when his phone, the secure phone, the one that only ever received contact from 2 sources, vibrated once in his pocket. He finished the photograph he was taking. He set down the camera. He looked at the screen. The message was 4 words, from an address he recognized as one of the 2 sources. He read it twice. Then he looked up, down the corridor, toward the stairs that Ava Quinn had just descended, and his face did something that documentation and thoroughness and professional care couldn't fully conceal. A flicker of something that moved through his expression like a shadow crossing a wall, fast and specific and gone almost before it registered. He put the phone back in his pocket. He picked up the camera. He finished his work. He finished his work with the same methodical precision he'd brought to everything else that night. And when he left the corridor, he left it clean. Documentation complete, evidence bagged, nothing out of place. A professional finishing a job, nothing to see. His name was Dolan. Specialist First Class Raymond Dolan, attached to Crane's unit for 18 months, cleared to the 3rd tier, trusted with the kind of access that required 2 separate background verifications and a psychological evaluation every 6 months. He had passed every one. He had a wife in Maryland and a daughter who was 8 years old and obsessed with marine biology, and he sent her photographs of whatever water he was near whenever his operational security permitted it, which was not very often, but often enough that she'd started a small album. None of this was relevant to what the 4 words on his screen meant. He walked to the east stairwell, descended to the ground floor, pushed through the door to the exterior maintenance corridor that ran along the building's outer edge. Technically still inside the facility's outer skin, a narrow utility passage used for HVAC access and pipe maintenance that was, at this moment, not under active camera coverage because 3 of the east side exterior units had been knocked offline by the storm and hadn't been restored yet. He had not chosen this route randomly. He stood in the cold of the passage and made a call that lasted 47 seconds. He spoke quietly, efficiently, with the practiced brevity of someone communicating in a channel that might not stay open. He said the facility was compromised operationally. He said the insertion team was gone. He said the primary asset's identity was confirmed. He said she was leaving in 6 hours for New Mexico. Then he ended the call, walked back through the door, and went to find coffee, because men who had nothing to hide found coffee after long nights. 3 floors up, Ava Quinn was reading the target package for Kestrel Ridge and did not know any of this yet, but she would. The flight to New Mexico took 4 hours and 20 minutes, routed through a military transit hub in Montana, where the aircraft changed and the paperwork changed, and Ava Quinn, traveling as Ava Quinn with her nursing credentials and her deployment orders, and a cover story that had been updated overnight with 72 hours of compressed operational preparation, became a different version of the same person. Not a new identity, a refined one. The Kestrel Ridge assignment had been in development for months. What had changed was only the timeline. She slept for 90 minutes on the second leg, which was not the sleep of exhaustion, but the disciplined rest of a person who understood sleep as a tactical resource and had trained herself to access it on demand. When she woke, she reviewed the updated target package that Crane's team had transmitted while she was in the air. The name on the second page of the folder was Marcus Hale. She hadn't said it out loud in 2 years. Hadn't needed to. The place he occupied in her operational history was documented at classification levels that didn't get spoken about casually, filed in the kind of institutional memory that only got retrieved when it became relevant again. She had not expected it to become relevant again. People who operated the way Hale operated tended to either get caught or go so deep that they became someone else entirely, and in 2 years of silence she had assigned equal probability to both outcomes and moved on. The file said he was the Meridian Network's inside asset at Kestrel Ridge. It said he'd been embedded there for 14 months, running the same model the Frosthaven source had been running: harvesting intelligence, building facility schematics, identifying the research wing's specific vulnerabilities, waiting for the acquisition operation to reach his location on the network's timeline. It said he was currently employed as a senior lab technician in Kestrel Ridge's secondary research division, with full clearance access to 3 of the facility's 4 wings. What the file didn't say, because it was the kind of thing that didn't make it into official records, was that Marcus Hale had once been one of the best intelligence assets she'd ever worked alongside, and that 2 years ago, something had shifted in him that she'd seen and reported and been told she was misreading. And 3 months later, he disappeared from the program under circumstances that were officially described as a voluntary separation with full honorable terms. She'd known, then, that the official description was wrong. She'd filed a supplementary assessment. It had been reviewed, noted, and filed at a tier she didn't have access to. And then the silence. The aircraft descended into the high desert air of New Mexico at 2:40 p.m., and the sky was the specific blue of high altitude and low humidity. Enormous and indifferent, nothing like Alaska's crushing white. The facility was 40 minutes from the landing strip, through landscape that looked empty and was not. She looked out the window at the distance and thought about a conversation she'd had with Marcus Hale on a rooftop in Vienna 3 years ago, when they'd been between operations, and the evening had been warm, and they'd talked about what made people choose the work they chose. He'd said something she'd remembered for its precision. The work chooses you or it doesn't. The people who think they chose it are usually the ones who eventually choose something else instead. She thought he was talking about commitment. She was no longer sure what he'd been talking about. Bet. Kestrel Ridge facility sat in a shallow valley ringed by low ridges that managed to be both scenic and strategically defensible, which was not a coincidence. From the air, it looked like a small campus, a cluster of low buildings in desert tan and gray, connected by covered walkways, surrounded by a perimeter fence that looked institutional and was considerably more than that. The security architecture was different from Frosthaven's. Less military, more federal research facility, calibrated for a different threat model. The kind of security that was designed to deter rather than repel, which worked until you were dealing with something that didn't deter. Ava arrived with a DoD contractor's escort and a transfer authorization that had cleared administrative channels 3 hours before her arrival. Compressed timeline, but within the range that wouldn't trigger automatic security review. She was introduced to the facility administrator, a man named Gerald Park, who was 61 years old, slightly hunched under the weight of decades of bureaucratic responsibility, and who greeted her with a specific brand of overworked courtesy extended to new staff who represented one more onboarding task in a full queue. "Nurse Quinn, glad to have you. We've been short-staffed in the medical wing since Renner transferred out." He shook her hand efficiently. "I'll have Tomas show you to your quarters and get you oriented." "I'd like to start immediately, actually," she said. Park blinked. "You just flew in from—" "I'm aware of where I flew in from." She smiled, a specific smile, the one calibrated to register as eager new employee rather than anything more purposeful. "I do better when I'm working, if it's all right." Park, who had spent his career surrounded by researchers and medical professionals who found idleness physiologically intolerable, recognized this immediately as reasonable. "Fine by me," he said. "Tomas." The orientation took 40 minutes. She used them. The medical wing layout confirmed what the blueprints had shown. 3 examination rooms, a small surgical suite, a pharmacy and supply room, a nursing station positioned at the junction of the main corridor with clean sight lines to the entrance and both exits. 43 personnel in the facility, currently 9 working the second shift, the others in quarters or off-site. Medical wing was staffed by 2 nurses plus the new arrival, supervised by Dr. Priya Mehta, who was 44, efficient, and visibly pleased to have the staffing numbers move in a better direction. "We've been running 2 people on day shift," Mehta said, walking her through the supply inventory with the brisk practicality of someone who'd been compensating for a deficit for a while. which is technically adequate but practically difficult when you have anything beyond routine cases. The research staff here have a talent for minor injuries. High-stress environment, Ava said. High-caffeine environment, mostly. But yes. Meta looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a physician evaluating a new colleague. Your record is solid. Emergency medicine rotation, trauma certification. That's more than I usually get in a transfer. I like to stay current. Good. We occasionally get cases that require it. Meta handed her the orientation checklist. Secondary research wing is off-limits to medical staff unless we're called in for a specific incident. Admin only. Escort required. Don't let anyone tell you differently. Understood, Ava said, and filed the specific way Meta said it. Not routine policy recitation, but the slightly firmer emphasis of someone who'd had to say it before and had reason to mean it. She completed her orientation. She stowed her personal kit in the locker assigned to her. She acquainted herself with the medical wing's crash cart protocol, the emergency communication system, the backup power switching procedure. She was thorough. She was personable in the way that didn't invite extended conversation. She was, to every person who interacted with her in the first 2 hours at Kestrel Ridge, precisely what her paperwork said she was. At 6:15 p.m., while doing a routine medication count in the pharmacy room, she saw Marcus Hale for the first time in 2 years. He was walking down the main corridor outside, moving in the direction of the secondary research wing, carrying a tablet and a coffee and the specific body language of someone who owned whatever space they occupied. He'd lost some weight since Vienna. His hair was shorter. He moved with the same particular qualities she remembered, not threatening, exactly, but spatially aware in a way that most civilians weren't. That fine-tuned environmental consciousness of someone who'd spent years in work that punished inattention. He didn't look toward the pharmacy room window. She watched him for the 3 seconds he was visible, and the thing she felt was not what sentiment or history might have predicted. It was colder and more useful than that. It was the specific settling of a variable into a confirmed position. He's here, this is real, the timeline is running, and the immediate subordination of everything else to the work. She turned back to the medication count. She noted that her hands were completely steady. The first 48 hours at Kestrel Ridge were a study in calibrated patience, which was perhaps the skill that separated workable intelligence operations from catastrophic ones more than any other single factor. She was building a picture, and pictures built wrong from the beginning didn't correct themselves mid-frame. She needed the layout of his routine, his access windows, the specific shape of what he was harvesting and how he was transmitting it, the contact architecture that connected him to whatever remained of the Meridian network after Frosthaven. She also needed to establish herself at Kestrel Ridge as exactly what she appeared to be, because, unlike Frosthaven, where the operation had resolved in a single violent night, Kestrel Ridge required a different approach. The network had been warned. Dolan's call had gone somewhere, and whatever that somewhere was, it was in communication with the network's remaining structure. Hale might know an asset at Frosthaven had been compromised. He might know the insertion team had been neutralized. What he couldn't know, what the operational security of the last 72 hours had been specifically designed to prevent, was that the woman now working in Kestrel Ridge's medical wing had any connection to any of it. The cover was clean. The timing was explainable. The paperwork was real. She worked her shifts. She was good at her job, which was not performance. The nursing was never performance. And Meta noticed and said so, with the spare approval of a physician who didn't distribute compliments as a social lubricant. She learned the rhythms of the facility, the personality of each wing, the informal social architecture of 43 people living and working in enforced proximity. She noted who talked to whom, who ate lunch alone, who lingered in the corridors after shift, who moved through the space with a specific kind of purposeful casualness that meant they were paying attention to something they didn't want to appear to be paying attention to. She transmitted 2 status reports to Crane in the first 48 hours, each one brief, each one precise, each one containing exactly the information that the operation needed and nothing extraneous. The third report, on the morning of day 3, contained something new. Hale was moving faster than the network's projected timeline. She'd identified his primary transmission window, a 20-minute period each evening when he was in the secondary research wing's equipment room, which had a blind spot in the camera coverage and a hardened network connection that the facility's IT security hadn't flagged as anomalous, because it was technically within operational parameters for his stated research function. She'd mapped his access patterns for 47 hours and identified that he was currently in the data aggregation phase of his collection operation, which meant he was close to having everything the Meridian network had sent him to get. Close meant days, possibly less. The compressed timeline at Frosthaven had compressed this timeline too, exactly as Crane had predicted. The network was feeling pressure, and its assets were being instructed to accelerate. Crane's response came back in under an hour. Confirm acquisition phase status. Do not engage until network transmission intercepted. We need the destination, not just the source, which meant she had to let him finish collecting, had to let him reach the transmission phase, when the data left the facility and the network endpoint became visible and catchable, which meant holding position while he completed the very thing she was there to prevent, for precisely long enough to turn it into a trap. She understood the logic. She also understood that logic and risk were not always comfortable neighbors. Set. On the morning of day 4, 2 things happened in the span of 3 hours that changed the texture of the operation in ways that the tactical models hadn't fully accounted for. The first was that a researcher in the secondary wing, a 30-year-old postdoc named Elliot Vance, who worked across the hall from Hale's station and had approximately none of his operational awareness, accidentally discovered something he shouldn't have. Not the intelligence operation, not the transmission equipment. Something more immediate and more dangerous. He found evidence of physical tampering with the secondary wing's environmental control system. The kind of tampering that someone with Hale's technical access could have accomplished, and that served a specific purpose. Ava understood the moment Meta pulled her aside at 9:40 a.m. and explained the situation. Vance is in exam room 2. He came in 30 minutes ago with acute symptoms: nausea, elevated heart rate, mild disorientation. Initially presented as possible hypoglycemia, but his glucose is normal. Meta's voice had the controlled urgency of someone reporting a medical situation that hasn't yet declared itself fully. He mentioned the secondary wing smells different, like something chemical. I've got another researcher coming in now with the same symptom cluster. Ava was already moving. Who else has been in the secondary wing in the last 4 hours? I need to check the access logs. Get them, and get the ventilation status for that wing. Environmental Control Office? Not the main system panel, they're separate. She was at Vance's exam room door. Is the wing evacuated? Not yet. It needs to be now. Everyone out. Seal the corridor access. Get them to the main building. Tell Park it's a precautionary measure. Potential chemical exposure, you don't need specifics yet. She pushed into the exam room. Vance was young, pale, sitting on the exam table with the confused expression of someone who'd gone from fine to not fine faster than their brain had processed. His pulse was elevated. She clocked it in the first 4 seconds. And his pupils were slightly dilated asymmetrically, which was the thing that mattered most. Not hypoglycemia, not anxiety. Elliot, she said, using his first name immediately, the way you did with patients who needed grounding. I'm Nurse Quinn. Tell me exactly when you first noticed the smell. Maybe an hour ago, I thought it was just the HVAC running different. Sometimes it does that. Did it make you feel immediately different or gradually? Gradually, like getting slowly car sick. He looked at her. Is it bad? It's treatable, she said, which was accurate and also the most useful thing she could tell him right now. She was running a differential in parallel with the conversation. The symptom cluster. The environmental delivery, the access to the ventilation system, the timeline. Were you alone in the wing? Hale was there earlier. He left maybe 40 minutes ago. She did not change expression. Anyone else? Not that I saw. She treated Vance. Supportive care, oxygen, monitoring, the standard response to suspected low-level chemical exposure while the specific agent was being identified. The second researcher, a woman named Carla Dine, came in 10 minutes later with a similar but slightly milder presentation, suggesting she'd had less direct exposure. Both stable, both going to be fine. But Hale had introduced something into the secondary wing's ventilation system, and the question of why, whether it was incapacitation, preparation, a distraction mechanism, or something else entirely, was a question that the answer to would change everything about how the next hours went. She transmitted to Crane at 10:15 a.m. Secondary wing environmental compromise. Possible incapacitation agent, low concentration, 2 casualties stable. Hail connection confirmed circumstantially. Timeline may be accelerated beyond current assessment. Awaiting your... Crane's response came before she finished composing. Intercept window closing. If he moves to transmit early, you do not wait for network endpoint. Contain the asset. Asset priority now supersedes transmission intercept. Ava read this twice, felt the weight of what it meant, the network endpoint, the transmission destination. The intelligence that would have taken the entire Meridian structure apart from the top down was now secondary to stopping Marcus Hale from leaving this facility with what he'd collected. A contained asset was a prosecution. A transmission was the network surviving to rebuild. Crane had made the call. She understood why. She disagreed with the calculus and knew her disagreement was filed somewhere in her operational record and would not change the directive. She secured her patience. She briefed Meta on the monitoring protocol for both, clearly and completely, because they were her patients and they deserved thoroughness regardless of what else was happening. She told Meta she needed to check on something in the East Corridor and would be back in 20 minutes. Meta looked at her with the steady gaze of a physician who had spent 4 days assessing her newest nurse and had arrived at a conclusion she hadn't shared. "Be careful," she said, which was not a thing you said to a nurse checking on a corridor situation. Ava looked at her. "I've been at this facility for 6 years," Meta said quietly. "I know the difference between a transfer paperwork situation and something else." A pause. "The people in my exam rooms need to be okay." "They will be," Ava said. "I promise you that specifically." Meta nodded once, and it was the nod of a person extending trust on a basis that wasn't procedural. Ava received it the way it was given, seriously, and with the understanding that promises made in operating environments carried weight precisely because of how rarely they should be made. She went to find Marcus Hale. He was not in the secondary wing. The wing was evacuated and sealed, the physical plant team responding to the environmental report with the systematic seriousness the situation warranted. He was not in the equipment room. He was not at any of the 3 locations where her 47 hours of pattern mapping said he spent significant time. He was in his quarters in the residential block, and the door was locked from the inside. She stood outside it for a moment. She was in scrubs, unarmed. Her kit was in the medical wing, and reaching it meant backtracking through 3 corridors and losing time she didn't have a clear read on. She ran the situation with the information she had. He was inside, the door was locked, and the fact that he was in his quarters at 10:45 a.m. when he was scheduled to be in the research wing told her he knew something had changed. The ventilation incident had either gone wrong ahead of his schedule or triggered a contingency she hadn't modeled. She knocked. 3 knocks. The rhythm and pressure of someone with a routine reason to be there. Nothing. "Marcus?" she said. A long pause, then, "You have the wrong room." "I have the right room," she said, "and you know my voice." Another pause. Longer, the kind that meant calculation rather than absence. She stayed where she was, weight even, posture neutral, nothing in her body language that the closed door could detect, but that she maintained out of habit, and because habits were what kept you functional when the situation stopped being familiar. The lock clicked. The door opened. Marcus Hale stood in the narrow gap, and 2 years had done what she'd read in the file and confirmed in the corridor 3 days ago. Weight gone, face harder in the specific way that came from sustained operational stress rather than age, eyes carrying something she hadn't seen there in Vienna, a quality she could only describe as concluded. Like someone who had finished making a decision and was now simply on the far side of it. He looked at her for a long moment. "You look like a nurse," he said. "I am a nurse." "Ava." He said her name the way people said the names of things they'd thought about at length before speaking. "Who sent you?" "Does it matter?" "It matters for the next 5 minutes," he said. "After that, maybe not." She looked at him steadily. "You put something in the ventilation system. Low concentration, disorienting, not dangerous. I needed the wing clear. 2 people are in my medical bay." Something moved in his expression, brief, controlled, but real. "They'll recover." "They will," she agreed. "Because I'm a nurse, and I treated them. That's not the point." "Ava, what did you need the wing clear for, Marcus?" He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, through the door gap, she could see the room. Ordered, minimal, the room of someone who'd been living lightly for a long time, keeping possessions at a level that permitted rapid departure. A laptop on the desk, a bag that was partially packed, a phone she didn't recognize, not standard issue, sitting next to the laptop with its screen dark. "I'm not what the file says," he said. "Tell me what you are." "I'm what I was," he said. "Still, what I was when you knew me." His voice was even, but underneath it was the specific tension of a person who has been carrying something in isolation for a very long time and is now in the first conversation in which saying it accurately is actually possible. "I went in voluntarily 14 months ago. They wanted an asset in the network, someone who could reach the upper command tier, not just the operation level, someone the network would accept as genuine." Ava stood very still. "The voluntary separation from the program," she said carefully. "That was cover, complete cover. 2 people above Crane knew, nobody else." He looked at her, and the thing in his eyes that she'd read as concluded she was now reading differently. Not the end of something, but the full weight of something that had been running for 14 months in absolute isolation, every day, with no one who knew. "I've been inside, Ava. Not running a collection operation for them, running one against them. The transmission tonight isn't Meridian data going out. It's Meridian's command tier, names, structure, funding sources, every operational thread they have running globally, going to our people." The corridor was completely silent. "Crane doesn't know," Ava said. "Crane can't know. If this reached the wrong desk at the wrong time..." He stopped. "There's a leak, not just at Frosthaven, higher, and until the transmission clears tonight, that leak is a live wire." The thing that happened in Ava's chest was not sentiment. It was the violent reorganization of every tactical assessment she'd made in the last 4 days. Every operational plan built on the assumption of his guilt being restructured in real time against the new variable, and the simultaneous arrival of 2 very different possibilities. That he was telling the truth, in which case Crane's containment directive would destroy 14 months of deep work and leave the Meridian command structure intact. Or that he was a man who knew exactly how she thought and had built a story precisely calibrated to the way she processed information. She looked at him. He looked back, and there was nothing in his face she could call a read. Not because it was blank, but because she knew him well enough to know that he was giving her exactly what was real and trusting her to distinguish it from performance, and that trust was itself a piece of information she couldn't afford to treat as neutral. "The phone," she said, looking past him at the desk. "Is that the transmission device?" "Yes." "When?" "Tonight, 9 p.m. The window is 20 minutes. She looked at him for a long moment. The directive from Crane was clear. Contain the asset. Now. Before the transmission, it was direct, explicit, non-discretionary. She thought about the leak Crane didn't know about. She thought about Dolan and the 47-second call from the maintenance corridor and the shadow that had crossed his face. She thought about 4 words on a screen that she hadn't seen and didn't know yet, but that were already, in ways she couldn't fully map, inside the walls of this operation. "You have until tonight at 9, she said, "to prove this to me." "Ava?" "I'm not containment," she said. "I'm not a directive. I'm a person who knew you before either of us was this. And I'm telling you that you have until 9 p.m. to show me something that makes what you just told me verifiable." Her voice was the same as it always was, even, precise, the voice that didn't shift under pressure. "If you can't, I'll do my job. Understood?" Hale looked at her for a long moment, and whatever was in his face was the most complicated thing she'd seen there, including Vienna, including everything. "Understood," he said. She turned and walked back down the corridor toward the medical wing, and behind her she heard his door close, and the click of the lock, and her own pulse. Steady and fast, keeping time against a clock that now had 11 hours on it. She turned the corner. At the end of the residential block corridor, 30 feet away, Gerald Park stood with 2 of Kestrel Ridge's security staff and a look on his face that told her immediately that this was not a routine administrator checking on the environmental incident. Next to him, holding a phone that was showing something on the screen, was a man she had never seen before in a federal contractor's jacket. He looked at her with the specific recognition of someone who had been given a photograph and has just confirmed it matches. Park looked at her with genuine confusion and genuine apology. The expression of a man who has been asked to do something he doesn't fully understand but has been given credentials that require compliance. "Nurse Quinn," he said, "I need to ask you to come with us." "What's this about?" she said, and her voice was exactly right. Not alarmed, not guilty, the natural query of someone who doesn't understand. "There's been a request," Park said, "from federal level regarding your clearance documentation." He paused. "I'm sure it's a misunderstanding." The man in the contractor's jacket was still looking at his phone. He hadn't looked up from it. He turned the screen slightly, not toward her, toward himself, and she caught half a second of what was on it before he angled it away. It was her photograph. Her real photograph, not the cover photo, from a file that should not exist at any level that Gerald Park or a federal contractor had access to. Someone had burned her cover. Not slowly, not through gradual exposure. Someone had reached into the institutional architecture above Crane's level and pulled a thread that had taken 8 months to construct and pulled it in the last 4 hours, precisely timed to the moment when she was 40 feet from Marcus Hale and 11 hours from a transmission that would either dismantle the Meridian network globally or disappear into it forever. She looked at Park. She looked at the security staff, 2 of them, positioned with the stance of people who'd been told this was probably routine and were carrying that assumption like a comfort they might need to drop quickly. She looked at the man with the phone. She smiled. She made it reach her eyes. She made it the smile of someone who has nothing to worry about and is mildly inconvenienced by bureaucratic process. "Of course," she said. "Let me just check on my patients first." "I'm afraid it needs to be now," the man with the phone said. His voice was professional. His eyes were not. Ava Quinn stood in the residential block corridor of Kestrel Ridge facility with the blizzard behind her and New Mexico's enormous sky overhead, and 11 hours on a clock that someone had just put a hand on, and she looked at the man with the phone and understood, with absolute clarity, that the next 60 seconds were going to determine whether everything that came after them was possible. She took a breath. She moved toward them. She moved toward them with the unhurried ease of someone who had already decided the next 60 seconds were manageable, and the decision itself was what made them manageable. Fear was a variable. Compliance bought time. Time was the only currency that mattered right now. "Lead the way," she said to Park. And her voice carried the mild cooperativeness of a nurse who found bureaucratic interruptions annoying but not alarming, and she watched Park's shoulders drop a fraction. The unconscious physical release of a man whose anxiety about the situation had just been partially absorbed by her apparent lack of it. The security staff adjusted similarly. Small things. Useful things. The man with the phone did not adjust. He walked slightly behind her, which was a positioning choice, and she noted it the way she noted all positioning choices, as information about what someone expected to need. They walked her to the administrative block, to a conference room that was being used as a temporary processing space, with a folding table and 3 chairs and the specific temporary quality of a situation that had been set up quickly. On the table, a laptop, an open file folder, and a landline phone that was already connected to something on the other end, the indicator light steady green. Park stood by the door, clearly uncomfortable. The 2 security staff positioned themselves outside it. The man with the contractor jacket, she still didn't have a name for him, which was itself a data point, sat across the table and opened the laptop with the brisk efficiency of someone working a checklist. "Your name," he said. "Ava Quinn. Place of employment prior to Kestrel Ridge. Frosthaven Military Medical Center, Alaska. Dates of service?" She gave them. Accurate because the cover's accuracy was the only thing that could survive this kind of direct pressure. The contractor typed. He was fast, and the speed told her he wasn't actually entering data. He was performing entry, giving his hand something to do while he watched her peripheral reactions. She gave him nothing. "Your clearance documentation was flagged this morning at 0800 through a federal contractor review process," he said. "Specifically, the secondary verification attached to your deployment authorization. There's a gap in the chain of custody that our review process flagged as irregular." "What kind of gap?" "The authorization was processed through a routing channel that's been suspended for reevaluation." He turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a portion of her deployment paperwork with a highlighted field she recognized immediately as the one Crane's team had used as the expedited activation pathway, the compressed timeline measure, the one that had been necessary to make the 72-hour deployment work. The channel wasn't suspended. It had been suspended by someone who had access to the administrative architecture above Crane's clearance tier, and had used that access in the last 4 hours specifically and surgically to create a procedural invalidation of her presence at Kestrel Ridge. She looked at the screen. She looked at him. "Who initiated the flag?" she said. "That's not information I'm authorized to share at this level of—" "Then we have a problem," she said, and her voice changed. Not dramatically, not the shift of someone losing composure, but the specific tonal adjustment of someone who has finished being cooperative and is beginning to be precise. Because the routing channel you're referencing handles a category of deployment authorization that is above your review tier, which means whoever flagged it either has access they shouldn't have or was given direction from someone who does. Either way, the flag itself is the anomaly, not my paperwork. The contractor looked at her steadily. "That's a characterization I'm not in a position to—" "I need to make a call," she said. "You're not currently authorized to—" "That phone," she said, looking at the landline on the table, the green light steady, the open line to wherever. "Is connected to who?" A pause. Brief, but real. "Federal Contractor Oversight, Northern Division," he said. "That's not a location," she said. That's a description." She looked at the phone. "And the line's been open since before I walked in, which means whoever is on the other end has been listening to this conversation." She shifted her gaze to the contractor. "So let me speak to them directly." Park made a small sound near the door. Not a word, just the involuntary vocal expression of a man watching a situation develop in a direction he didn't have a framework for. The contractor said nothing for a moment. Then he reached across the table and turned the phone's speaker function on. The ambient sound of the open line filled the room. The faint white noise of a connection, the almost silence of someone present but not speaking. "This is Quinn," she said to the room, to the phone, to whoever was on the other end of that green light. "I know you burned the channel. I know the timeline on that burn, and I know it wasn't random." A pause. "I also know that the asset you're trying to contain right now is the thing standing between the Meridian Network's command structure and a transmission window that closes in." She looked at the clock on the wall. 10 hours and 42 minutes. "So whoever you are, you need to decide in the next 30 seconds whether your play tonight is worth the permanent destruction of 14 months of deep penetration work." Silence. Then, "Step out, Hargrove." A man's voice through the phone, flat and deliberate. The contractor, Hargrove now, closed his laptop, stood, and walked to the door without looking at Ava. He said something brief to the security staff outside. The door closed. Park looked at Ava, then at the phone, then made the intelligent decision to become as invisible as a 61-year-old administrator could manage in a 10 by 12 conference room. The voice on the phone said, "You're further along than I expected." "Then your expectations were poorly calibrated," she said. A short pause. "Hale told you." "Hale told me something. I haven't decided yet how much of it I believe." "That's honest." The voice had the quality of someone who was used to conversations happening at a level that most people didn't know existed, and who found the rarity of a conversation partner operating at that level mildly notable. "What would make it believable?" "The same thing that makes anything believable," she said. "Verification." The verification came in 4 parts, delivered over 22 minutes through the phone line, while Park sat motionless in his corner and the green light held steady, and Ava Quinn sat at the folding table and listened with the complete still focus she brought to everything that mattered. The voice on the phone belonged to a man named Aldrich Fossey. She would learn this later. At this point, he was still a voice, and the voice was sufficient. It emerged in the texture of the conversation rather than direct statement, positioned at a tier that made Crane look like mid-management, not the top. The intelligence apparatus didn't really have a top. It had a series of nested authorities that expanded outward like the rings of a target, but high enough that the routing channel Hargrove had flagged was within his administrative reach, and the suspension had been accomplished with 2 keystrokes and a classification override that no one below his level could challenge. He had not burned her cover to stop the operation. He had burned her cover to force a conversation that couldn't happen through normal channels because normal channels were the problem. The leak that Marcus Hale had identified 14 months ago from inside the Meridian Network The leak that sat somewhere above Crane in the intelligence hierarchy had a name. Fosse had known the name for 6 weeks. He had not been able to act on it through standard procedure because standard procedure ran through the exact institutional pathway the leak controlled, which meant every action taken through channels was visible to the person those channels were supposed to expose. He needed the Meridian transmission to happen tonight. Not because of what it would do to the Meridian network, though that was real and significant, but because of what it would do to the leak. The transmission was going to an endpoint that Fosse had access to through a parallel pathway. When it arrived, it would contain, embedded in Hale's 14 months of collected intelligence, a specific data package that would document the leak's connection to the Meridian network in a form that was legally and institutionally unimpeachable. Hale had built the trap. Fosse had provided the architecture, and Crane's containment directive, issued in good faith, issued correctly based on the information she had, was the one thing that could dismantle it. Crane doesn't know, Ava said. Crane can't know. Her communication channels run through the compromised pathway. You're telling me Crane has been issuing directives through a pipeline that the leak could monitor? Since approximately 8 weeks ago, yes. The penetration was recent and sophisticated. A pause. She doesn't know. That's not a characterization of her capability. The penetration was designed to be invisible to someone operating within the system. Ava was quiet for a moment. She was doing the full accounting, all the pieces, Dolan at Frosthaven, the flag on her deployment channel, the timing of Hargrove's arrival, the ventilation incident that had accelerated everything, the 47-second call she hadn't witnessed but had been briefed on during transit, each piece finding its position. Dolan, she said. Collected 2 hours ago, Fosse said. He made 4 contacts between Frosthaven and now. Every one of them went somewhere useful. Who is the leak? A pause that was 3 seconds long, and in those 3 seconds, Ava understood that the answer was going to reframe something, the way answers at this level always reframed something, never adding information to a neutral space, but always replacing one version of the world with another. Deputy Director Sylvia Crane, Fosse said, is not the leak, but the man who briefed her on the Kestrel Ridge timeline and provided the operational parameters for your deployment is. She waited. His name is Garrison Webb, Fosse said. Deputy Chief of Operations, Special Programs Division. He's been running a secondary channel to the Meridian Network's upper command for 11 months. Everything that moved through special programs, asset placements, operational timelines, cover architectures, he saw first. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, Frosthaven's Marine commander, had a cousin with a similar name in an unrelated context, which was coincidence. The man Fosse was describing was someone else entirely, someone at a desk somewhere who had seen Ava's deployment file before Crane had, and had been feeding its contents upward into a network that had then used that information to burn her channel and send Hargrove to Kestrel Ridge in a narrow window designed to stop tonight's transmission before it happened. He knows about the transmission, she said. He knows Hale is in the facility. He knows a transmission is scheduled. He doesn't know the full content. Hale compartmentalized the data package architecture specifically to prevent premature exposure. A brief pause. But he knows enough to want it stopped. And sending Hargrove to detain me was his play, yes, through a contractor channel he controls that sits outside Crane's direct oversight. Plausible deniability, a procedural flag on irregular paperwork, routine compliance review. Nothing that looks like targeted interference, unless someone's looking for it. Which you now are, Fosse said, and there was something in his voice that might have been satisfaction at a sequence of events running correctly, the particular tone of a very patient person watching the architecture they've built begin to function as designed. The question is whether the next 10 hours run without further interference. You could have briefed Crane directly when you confirmed Webb. I could have. And Webb would have known within 40 minutes, because Crane would have initiated the standard notification protocol which runs through Special Programs Division, which runs across his desk. Another pause. I needed a parallel path, an asset already in position who could hold the operation together from inside the facility without routing through the compromised channel. He paused. You were already there. Ava sat with this for a moment. The particular feeling of understanding you were inside a design that had accounted for you, not as a pawn, but as a necessary component, placed precisely, trusted to function. It was not an uncomfortable feeling. It was the feeling of work being treated as what it actually was. "Hale," she said. He knew none of this. He knew there was a leak at the operational level. He didn't know where. He's been running on isolation protocols for 14 months. No contact upward, no verification, complete operational silence except for the one transmission window tonight. Fossey's voice was steady. "He built this alone, Ava. 14 months of it." She heard this. She held it for exactly as long as it needed to be held, then filed it in the place where things that mattered but couldn't be indulged in right now were kept. "Call off Hargrove," she said. "Restore the routing channel. I need my cover intact for the next 10 hours, and I need Park to believe this was a misunderstanding." Already in motion. "And Crane?" "She'll be briefed simultaneously with the transmission. The moment it clears, everything moves, Webb's channel gets shut, his access gets suspended, the institutional process begins. She needs to be in the conversation from the start of that, not before it." "She's going to be angry," Ava said. "She's going to be angry," Fossey agreed. "She's also going to be effective. Those aren't mutually exclusive." Ava stood from the table. "Then we have 10 hours. 9 hours, 58 minutes, he said, and ended the call. Hargrove was brief and smooth about the reversal, the model of a professional managing an outcome he hadn't chosen. He apologized to Park for the disruption, cited a documentation reconciliation that had resolved satisfactorily, and was gone from the facility inside 15 minutes. Park stood in his own corridor and watched him go with the expression of a man who had been given an explanation that technically answered all his questions and somehow left him feeling that he understood less than when he started. He turned to Ava. "Are you all right?" "Fine," she said, and because Park was a decent man who deserved something. "These things happen with cross-agency paperwork. It's bureaucratic, not sinister." "Right," he said, with the tone of a man filing that characterization somewhere next to several others he was choosing not to examine too closely. "Your patients are asking for you." She went back to the medical wing. She checked on Vance and Dine, both stable, both showing improving symptom profiles, both going to be discharged to quarters by evening with monitoring instructions. She updated their charts with the thorough attention she always gave to charting, because the documentation was the record, and the record existed regardless of what else was happening. She talked to Vance for a few minutes, because he was young and shaken, and the psychological component of an unexpected chemical exposure deserved the same treatment time as the physiological one. Meta found her at the nursing station at 2:15 p.m. She stood next to Ava and looked at nothing in particular and said, in a low voice, "The paperwork thing." "Resolved," Ava said. "Good." A pause. "Hale hasn't come to the dining hall for lunch. He usually does." Another pause. "I notice things. It's a medical habit." "It's a useful habit," Ava said. Meta looked at her profile. "The people in my building," she said carefully. "Safe," Ava said. "I need them safe, and I need the building running normally for the rest of today. That's the specific thing I need from you." Meta was quiet for a moment, then, "You'll tell me when it's over?" "Yes," Ava said. "I'll tell you when it's over." Meta nodded and went back to her work, and Ava watched her and thought, not for the first time in 7 years, that the people who kept their professional integrity intact in proximity to the work, who chose not to ask the questions that would compromise their ability to function, were doing something that required more active decision than it appeared. At 3:40 p.m., she went to find Hale. He was in the secondary research wing, which had been cleared by environmental safety and reopened with a formal advisory note about HVAC maintenance that Park's staff had accepted without pushback. Hale was at his station, working, and the quality of his work, the focused, unremarkable productivity of a man performing his stated function, was so complete that anyone watching from a normal vantage point would see exactly what they expected to see. She came in through the side corridor access, and he didn't visibly react to her arrival, which meant he'd heard her coming and had already decided on his response. She sat at the workstation adjacent to his, pulled up a facility maintenance form on the terminal, something plausible, and said nothing for a moment. "Fossey," she said quietly. "A beat. You talked to him. He called the play for tonight. I need you to walk me through the transmission architecture so I can protect it. Hale set down what he was holding. He looked at the screen in front of him, not at her, which was the right instinct for a conversation in a room with internal cameras. The transmission runs through the facility's research network on a ghost protocol. It'll look like routine encrypted data transfer, the kind the secondary wing runs constantly. Duration 18 minutes. The data package is compressed and fragmented, so even if someone catches the transmission in real time, they can't interrupt it selectively. It either goes or it doesn't. Garrison Webb knows you're here and knows there's a transmission scheduled. Hale absorbed this with the stillness of someone receiving information that confirms a shape they'd already suspected. He'll try to cut the network. She agreed. From outside the facility, through whatever administrative access he has to the research division's communication architecture. Which means I need someone inside the building with access to the physical network infrastructure who can hold the line against an external interruption for 18 minutes. That's me, he said. That's you, she said. And I need to know. If Webb pushes hard enough to threaten the physical hardware, sends someone into the building, pulls the contractor card the way Hargrove was pulled, how long can you hold? Depends on how they come in and how many. He paused. Long enough if you're running interference. That's what I'll be doing. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see her in his peripheral line. The ventilation thing. I know. I'm sorry about your patients. They're fine. I know they are. I still... He stopped. It got complicated faster than the model predicted. It usually does, she said. And then because it needed to be said once and only once, 14 months, Marcus, alone. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah. We'll talk about it when this is done. If this goes the way it's supposed to go, he said, there's going to be a lot of talking. She stood. She straightened the maintenance form on the screen, hit save, and turned toward the exit as if she'd finished routine business. At the door, she stopped. 9 p.m., she said. Don't be early. Never am, he said, and turned back to his work, and she walked out into the corridor. The afternoon ran its course with the surface calm of a facility doing what facilities do. Work, meals, the small interpersonal weather of people coexisting in close quarters. Ava ran her shift, checked her patients, maintained the precise texture of unremarkable competence that had carried her through Frosthaven and through 6 weeks of careful construction, and was now carrying her through the last hours of something that had been running, in various forms, for over a year. At 6:30 p.m., the facility's primary research network registered an attempted administrative override from an external source. The override was routed through a federal contractor access channel, the same class of channel Hargrove had used, and targeted the secondary wing's data transfer permissions. It was sophisticated, drawing on legitimate administrative credentials, and under normal operational circumstances, it would have succeeded quietly and without leaving a footprint that anyone inside the facility would recognize. Kestrel Ridge's IT security lead, a thorough woman named Dana Obi, who had been in the job for 3 years and had never encountered an attempted override that came through a channel this clean, flagged it as anomalous and routed it to Park's attention. Park called Ava. She didn't know why he called her specifically. Perhaps Meta had said something. Perhaps he'd made his own assessment over the course of the afternoon. Perhaps he was simply a man who called the person in his building who seemed to have the clearest understanding of the current situation. He didn't frame it as more than a technical question. He said there was an irregular access attempt on the secondary wing network and that Obi had flagged it and he wasn't sure what to do with it. Don't process it, she said. Document it and don't process it. Tell Obi to log every attempt and timestamp everything she sees. A pause. How many attempts so far? Dana said 1, but she's watching for more. There will be more, Ava said. Tell her to hold the line. She ended the call and looked at the clock. 2 hours and 18 minutes. The attempts came at 7:15, 7:40, and 8:02 p.m., each one cleaner than the last, each one using a slightly different credential architecture, each one finding the same wall. Donna Obi at her station, logging, timestamping, not processing, holding. She was doing it without knowing fully why, operating on Park's instruction and the specific weight that Ava's 2 sentences had carried, and she was doing it with the focused stubbornness of a person who had been given a simple, clear task and was not going to fail it. At 8:20 p.m., the attempt stopped. In the 38-minute silence that followed, Ava stood in the medical wing and ran every variable she could reach. The silence wasn't surrender. It was recalibration. Webb had tried the administrative route and found it blocked. What he did next would tell her something important about how much operational capacity he was willing to expose. At 8:51 p.m., 9 minutes before the transmission window, a vehicle arrived at Kestrel Ridge's main gate. Security logged it as a federal compliance inspection, arriving with documentation that cleared the gate's standard verification system. Documentation that was real, issued through a channel Webb controlled, flagged for Emergency After Hours Compliance Authority. 2 men in federal contractor gear, the kind of thing that, presented correctly, moved through facility security without generating the friction of an obvious intrusion. Ava was already moving when her phone showed Park's number. She didn't answer it. She was in the corridor connecting the administrative block to the research wing, and she was moving at the pace of someone who had done the distance calculation and found it workable. And behind her, the door to the medical wing opened and Meta's voice carried down the corridor. "Quinn, medical wing stays clear," Ava said without turning. "Keep everyone in. 20 minutes. She didn't hear Meta's response. She was through the junction door and into the secondary wing corridor, and the clock in her head said 8 minutes and 40 seconds. The 2 men from the vehicle were coming through the main entrance, which gave her approximately 4 minutes before they reached the secondary wing access. 4 minutes of gate processing, facility navigation, a building they hadn't mapped in person. She had the advantage of the building. She had the advantage of those 4 minutes. She reached the secondary wing. Hale was at his station, the transmission interface open on his screen, the clock in the corner reading 8:53 p.m. He looked at her when she came in and she gave him the situation in 6 words. 2 incoming. Network hold. Go at 9. He nodded and turned back to the screen, and the thing she saw in his posture was the full-body commitment of someone who had been building toward a single moment for 14 months and was now positioned to complete it, and who was going to complete it regardless of what happened in the corridor outside. She took her position. She knew the layout. She knew the angles, the choke points, the single corridor approach that served the secondary wing. One way in, which meant one way to hold. She was unarmed in scrubs in a federal research facility at 8:54 p.m., and she had 6 minutes to make that fact irrelevant. The first man came through the secondary wing access door at 8:57 p.m., and he was good. Federal contractor quality, moving fast and purposefully, credentials in hand, the whole performance of legitimate compliance activity laid over the top of what was actually operational interference. His partner was 30 seconds behind him in the corridor. "Sir," she said, stepping into his path with the perfectly calibrated presence of a medical professional who had every right to be exactly where she was. "This wing is restricted access pending environmental clearance. I need to see your health screening documentation." He looked at her. He looked at her scrubs, her position, her complete calm. He reached for his credentials. Federal compliance. "Requires health screening for post-environmental incident access," she said, and she was already reaching for the tablet she'd pulled from the nursing station, turning it toward him. And he looked at the screen and spent 1.7 seconds processing the official-looking form displayed there. And in those 1.7 seconds, she was reading him. His positioning, his balance, whether the hand going for credentials was his dominant one, what he was actually prepared for in this moment. He was prepared for administrative friction. He was prepared to push through it with authority. He was not, she assessed, prepared for the encounter to become physical, because he was operating on the assumption that a nurse in a corridor was a delay, not a threat. Behind him, his partner appeared in the secondary wing doorway. In the equipment room at the end of the corridor, the clock hit 9 p.m. Marcus Hale initiated the transmission, and Ava Quinn, in the corridor between 2 federal contractors, and the room where 14 months of work was now flowing irreversibly toward a destination that would end Garrison Webb's career and dismantle the Meridian Network's command structure, looked at the first man and said very quietly, "You're going to want to wait in the main lobby." The man stared at her. "The transmission is already running," she said. "You're 45 seconds too late, and everyone who sent you here is going to know that within the next 18 minutes. At which point you have 2 options. You can be a federal contractor who was present during a compliance check when an intelligence operation concluded successfully, which is a paperwork problem, not a legal one. Or you can be someone who physically interfered with a classified transmission on the instruction of a man who is currently being documented as a network asset. She held his gaze. I'd suggest the lobby. He looked at her. He looked at the corridor behind her. He made the calculation. He looked at his partner. Something passed between them, the rapid professional assessment of two people recalibrating in real time. They went to the lobby. Ava turned back to the equipment room door. Through it, she could hear the faint mechanical hum of active data transfer, steady and continuous, the sound of something that had been built over 14 months of isolation and silence, finally completing its single, necessary function. She stood in the corridor, and she waited, and she let it run. 12 minutes later, her phone vibrated, a number she didn't have saved. She answered. Transmission confirmed received, Fossey said. Package intact. Webb's channel is being suspended as of this moment. Crane is being briefed. A pause. It's done. She stood in the corridor of the Kestrel Ridge secondary wing with her hand on the phone and the hum still in the air, fading now, the transfer completed, the 18 minutes over. Hale, she said. Being extracted in the morning, full debrief, full protection. He's been cleared at every tier. The record is being corrected retroactively. His separation documentation will be amended. Fossey paused. He'll want to know that first. I'll tell him, she said. She ended the call. She stood there for a moment in the quiet of a building that didn't know what had just happened inside it, that was going about its evening in the ordinary way of places where enormous things occur invisibly. The equipment room door opened and Marcus Hale stepped into the corridor. He looked at her. He looked at the walls, the ceiling, the specific quality of air in a space where something has just permanently changed. It went? He said. It went, she said. He breathed out, one long, slow exhale that was 14 months of held tension looking for somewhere to go. He looked at his hands. He looked at her. Webb, he said. Being processed now. Crane. Being briefed. He nodded slowly, absorbing the shape of a world that had just rearranged itself around a transmission he'd spent over a year building toward. Then he looked at her with an expression that had found its way through everything that expression had been in the last week. The Vienna version, the closed-door version, the version from this afternoon, and arrived somewhere that was more stripped than any of them. Not relief exactly, not triumph, something quieter and more fundamental. The expression of someone who has completed a thing they weren't sure they'd survive completing. You believed me, he said, this afternoon, when you could have contained me. I verified you, she said. That's not the same thing. For you, they're close enough. She looked at him for a moment. Get some sleep. Your extraction team is wheels up at 0600. She turned and walked back down the corridor toward the medical wing, and her footsteps were the same as they always were, steady and unhurried, carrying no visible evidence of the evening's events. She passed the junction. She passed the administrative block where Hargrove had sat across a table from her with a phone and a set of assumptions that had lasted 40 minutes. She passed the door to the lobby, where two federal contractors were sitting, one of them on a phone, both of them having a very different evening than they'd planned. She pushed through the door to the medical wing and nearly walked into Meta, who was standing on the other side of it with her arms folded and the expression of a physician who has spent the last 20 minutes making a decision about how to feel. Everyone okay? Ava said. My patients are fine, Meta said. The building is fine. She looked at her. Are you fine? Ava considered this with the honest attention she gave everything. I will be, she said. By morning, Meta looked at her for a long moment, then unfolded her arms and turned back toward the nursing station. I'm going to need a complete incident report for the environmental exposure case, she said. Standard form, by 800. I'll have it done by 6, Ava said. You never stop working, do you? Not on nights like tonight, she said, and followed her back into the medical wing, where the lights were warm and steady, and Vance was asleep in his room, and Dine was reading something on her phone, and the work, the real, ordinary, necessary work, was waiting. She sat at the nursing station. She opened the incident report form. She began to write. She was 3 paragraphs in when her secure line buzzed. Not Fossey, a different number, one she recognized as a Crane tier contact routing. She looked at the screen. The message was brief, and it was not from Crane. It was from Garrison Webb. 4 words sent from a device that was currently being tracked by 4 separate intelligence agencies, and that he either didn't know was compromised or no longer cared. I know what's next. She stared at the screen for a long moment. She put the phone face down on the desk. She looked at the incident report. 3 paragraphs complete, waiting for the rest. Then she picked up the phone again and read the message one more time. Because the thing about 4 words from a man who was currently being dismantled by the institutional machinery of a transmission he'd spent months trying to prevent was that they were either the desperate noise of someone with nothing left to lose, or they were the one variable that nobody, not Fossey, not Hale, not the 14 months of deep intelligence work that had built tonight, had fully accounted for. The kind of variable that had a way of rewriting the shape of everything that came after it. I know what's next. She read it a 3rd time and the words didn't change, which was the point of words. They held their shape regardless of how many times you looked at them, regardless of whether you wanted them to mean something smaller than they did. She set the phone on the desk and finished the incident report. All 6 paragraphs, complete and accurate, filed at 11:47 p.m. She did this not because the incident report was more important than the message, but because the discipline of finishing what needed to be finished was the only thing that kept the work from consuming itself, and because Vance and Dine had a right to documentation that was thorough, regardless of everything else happening in the building tonight. Then she picked up her secure line and called Fossey. He answered in 2 rings, which told her he was still awake and had been expecting contact. Quinn. Webb sent a message, she said, and read it to him. Silence for 4 seconds. From which device? The one your people are tracking. He knows it's tracked, Fossey said, and his voice had shifted. Not alarmed, but recalibrated, the specific tonal adjustment of someone updating a threat model in real time. He sent it because he wanted us to receive it. I know. Which means it's not intelligence. It's a move. I know that too, she said. The question is what he's moving toward. Another pause. We pulled his access the moment the transmission cleared. Every channel he controls, every administrative credential, every pathway into the institutional architecture. His ability to act from a desk is gone. A beat. But Garrison Webb didn't run a parallel intelligence operation for 11 months from a desk alone. He has people, assets he built outside the program's visibility, specifically because he understood that the program might eventually look for them. Off-book assets, she said. 3 that we've identified in the last 2 hours. 2 are already being located. The 3rd, a pause that was longer than the others, weighted with the specific gravity of information that changes the immediate operational picture. The 3rd is unaccounted for. Last known position puts him within driving distance of Kestrel Ridge. Ava looked at the medical wing around her, the warm, steady lights. Maida, at the far end of the nursing station, reviewing charts, the quiet of rooms where patients slept. How long? 3 hours at the outside. Probably less. What's the play? If Webb is already dismantled institutionally, if the transmission is complete and documented, and in the process of becoming the foundation of a federal prosecution, what does sending someone to Kestrel Ridge accomplish? Nothing, in terms of the operation. The operation is over. Fossey's voice was flat and careful. What it accomplishes is personal. Webb is looking at the destruction of everything he built over 11 years. He knows Hale's 14 months of intelligence is going to dismantle every meridian thread globally. He knows his career, his freedom, and his institutional identity are in the process of ending. A pause. The message isn't a tactical move. It's the move of a man who wants the person responsible to know it isn't over before it's over. He thinks Hale is responsible, she said. He thinks Hale is responsible, Fossey agreed. He doesn't know about you, not completely. He knows an asset at Kestrel Ridge was connected to the operation. Hargrove's report would have confirmed that much. But the specific shape of your involvement, the role you played, the fact that the cover was held? No. He's coming for Hale. She was already standing. Extraction timeline. I'm pushing it up. I can have a team at the facility in 90 minutes. Webb's asset could be there in less. I know. A pause that carried weight. Quinn, you've been running since Alaska. You don't have... Don't, she said. He stopped. 90 minutes, she said. I'll hold the building. She ended the call and stood for a moment in the medical wing with the phone in her hand and the full shape of the night stretching out ahead of her. Not the shape she'd planned, not the shape the operation had been designed around, but the shape that things always took when human will and human rage introduced variables that tactical models couldn't fully account for. She breathed in. She breathed out. She looked at the clock. Then she went to find Marcus Hale. He was awake. She'd expected that. Men who completed 14-month operations didn't sleep easily in the hours immediately after, the body still running the cortisol load of sustained high-stakes existence, even when the external demand had been removed. He was in his quarters, sitting on the edge of his bed with a glass of water and the specific hollow quality of someone who has been tightly compressed for a very long time and is only now beginning to feel the edges of what they've been holding. She gave him the situation in 60 seconds. No softening, no framing. He didn't need either, and there wasn't time for it. When she finished, he looked at her with the expression of someone who has learned to receive bad news without wasting motion on it. How many? 1 confirmed incoming, possibly more. Webb's people, the off-book ones, they'll be former military, private contract quality. He set down the water. He'd have chosen people he trusted completely, which means people who believed in what he was doing, not just people he was paying. But true believers are more dangerous than contractors, she said. Yes, he said simply. I need you in the most defensible part of this building for the next 90 minutes, she said. Not because you can't handle yourself, because your extraction team is 90 minutes out, and you are the reason the operation succeeded, and I am not delivering you to Fosse in a condition that requires medical intervention. Something moved across his face. A flicker of what might have been protest, the instinct of someone whose 14 months of isolated operation had made solitary responsibility feel like a default state. And then it resolved into the cleaner thing, the thing underneath the instinct. Trust, extended deliberately to someone who'd earned it in a specific corridor on a specific afternoon. All right, he said. Where? She had already assessed the building for this. The answer was the medical wing. Not because it was the most fortified location, it wasn't, but because it had the best sightline architecture, the most defensible single-point access, and because it was where Meta was and where Vance and Dine were sleeping, and she was not going to choose a position that abandoned her patients to whatever arrived at this facility tonight. The medical wing had 1 corridor entrance and 3 rooms that could be secured from the inside and a crash cart that contained, among its standard equipment, several items that became significantly more useful than their stated medical purpose in the right application. She also needed to tell Meta. This was not a calculation. It was a debt. She'd asked Meta to trust her 3 hours ago, and Meta had, and that trust deserved the truth, or as much of the truth as was currently operational to share. Meta received it the way Ava had come to expect her to receive things. Straight, without flinching, the quiet courage of someone who had chosen a profession that required presence in rooms where presence was uncomfortable. She asked 2 questions. The first, were the patients in danger? The second, what did she need to do? Both questions were, Ava thought, exactly right. Keep them in their rooms and keep those doors locked, she said. If you hear anything that sounds like a situation in the main corridor, you stay in the wing. You do not open the access door for anyone who does not give you the code word. Which is? Frosthaven, she said. Meta nodded. Frosthaven. She looked at Ava steadily. You do this regularly. I do this when it's necessary. Tonight it's necessary. Tonight it is, Ava said. Meta looked at her for one more moment with the expression of a person who has looked at a colleague for 4 days and understood, retroactively, that every observation they made was simultaneously accurate and entirely incomplete. When this is over, she said, I'm going to have so many questions. I'll answer the ones I'm able to, Ava said. That's more than I can usually offer. It seemed to be enough. Meta went to check on her patients, and Ava went to the access door and took her position. The unaccounted-for asset arrived at 1:14 a.m. Not through the main gate. That had been locked down on Fosse's instruction within 20 minutes of their call, Security staff briefed with enough of the situation to close the facility to new arrivals without being given enough to panic. He came through the perimeter fence on the east side, a cut entry that suggested advanced knowledge of the camera gap. The same camera gap that Dolan had used at Frosthaven, which told her something about how Webb had built his off-book network and the specific institutional knowledge he'd drawn on to construct it. His name, she would learn later, was Cole Prater. Ex-Marine, medically discharged 4 years ago, privately contracted since, with 3 years of working in Webb's shadow network on operations that would make prosecutors grateful for the detail Hale's transmission had provided. He was 38 years old, 6'2", and he moved through the facility grounds with the confident efficiency of someone who had memorized a blueprint, which he had. Webb had access to Kestrel Ridge's facility schematics through the Special Programs channel, and had passed them along with the specificity of a man who wanted this done correctly. What the blueprint told him was the layout. What it didn't tell him was where, inside that layout, Ava Quinn had positioned herself. She heard him enter the residential block first. The wrong choice, which meant he'd calculated that Hale would have stayed in his quarters. She gave him 90 seconds in there before she heard the sound of a door being assessed, and then the specific silence of someone realizing the room they'd expected to be occupied was empty and recalibrating. The recalibration took him toward the medical wing at 1:19 a.m. She heard him in the main corridor before she saw him. Footsteps with the weight and rhythm of a man moving under operational focus, not rushing, not hesitating, covering ground the way someone covered ground when they'd done it professionally for years. She was positioned at the interior side of the access door, which gave her the sightline she needed and removed the angle he'd have on approach. The access door opened. Cole Prater stepped into the medical wing, and in the first quarter second of his entry, he registered that the space wasn't what the blueprint had mapped. Not because the layout was wrong, but because the lighting was different, lower than the blueprint's illumination specifications. And the nursing station that should have been the primary sightline anchor was empty. And the spatial architecture of what should have been a simple corridor approach had been altered by the repositioning of 2 equipment carts in the 45 minutes she'd had to prepare it. A quarter second was all she needed. She was behind him before he'd completed his assessment, and the next 22 seconds were precise and purposeful, and ended with Cole Prater on the floor of the Kestrel Ridge medical wing, with his weapon removed and his mobility comprehensively addressed, and the particular shocked stillness of a man who has been completely outclassed by something he hadn't seen coming. He looked up at her from the floor. He looked at Scrubs. He looked at the medical wing, the nursing station, the specific indignity of his current position in a place that smelled like antiseptic and was decorated with patient hygiene charts. "You're the nurse," he said, and the bewilderment in his voice was genuine. "I'm the nurse," she agreed. She secured him and she called Fossey, and she gave him the update in 22 words, and then she sat on the edge of the nursing station desk and looked at the ceiling and let the adrenaline metabolize at its own pace, because there was no shortcut for that particular process. There was only time and stillness, and the slow return of normal physiological function, which arrived eventually, as it always did. At 1:38 a.m., Marcus Hale appeared in the medical wing doorway. He looked at Prater on the floor, he looked at Ava on the desk, he looked at the reorganized equipment carts. "I wasn't in the most defensible part of the building," he said. "You were in a locked room 2 corridors away," she said. That qualified. "You handled it alone." I handle most things alone," she said, and it came out with less performance than she'd intended. More honest, more bare. The thing underneath the professional cadence surfacing briefly in a quiet room at 1:40 in the morning after a very long several days. Hale heard it. He didn't comment on it, which was exactly right. He walked to the chair by the nursing station and sat in it, and they existed in the same space, in the companionable, weightless quiet of 2 people who had come through something together and were on the other side of it. "What happens now?" he said. "Your extraction team is 50 minutes out. You go with them. Full debrief, protection detail, record correction. Your operational file gets rebuilt from the ground up with the accurate version of the last 14 months. She paused. "You're going to have to tell the whole story, start to finish, to people who will document every word. It'll be thorough and it'll be long. And after that?" She looked at him. "After that is after that. One thing at a time." He nodded slowly. Then, "What about you?" She looked at the window. The New Mexico night outside, enormous sky, more stars than most of the world ever saw. The kind of dark that was full rather than empty. "I have an incident report to file," she said. "A patient discharge to complete in the morning, and a conversation with a facility administrator who deserves better than the version of events he's been given." She paused. "And then I imagine Fosse has something to say. He'll want to debrief you." "He'll want to debrief me," she agreed. "And then there'll be another assignment. There's always another assignment. Do you want there to be?" She considered this with the genuine honesty that the question, asked by someone who knew her well enough to ask it without agenda, deserved. "I want the work to matter," she said finally. "Tonight it mattered. Most nights it does." A pause. "That's enough. What?" The extraction team arrived at 2:24 a.m. in two unmarked vehicles that came through the reopened main gate with credentials that cleared without a question. 4 people, efficient and professional, who collected Prater with the procedural thoroughness of people who understood they were collecting evidence as much as a person. They gave Hale a clean kit and a brief and treated him with the specific careful respect extended to someone whose file had been corrected at the highest level and who was being handled accordingly. Before he went with them, he stopped in the medical wing doorway. "Vienna," he said. She looked at him. "The rooftop. You said something I didn't finish hearing, and then the operation started and—" He stopped, looked at her. "I've been thinking about it for 3 years. She looked back at him for a moment that was long enough to be honest. "I said that the work choosing you doesn't mean it gets to be the only thing," she said. "I said there was a difference between being committed and being consumed. And then I said that I hadn't figured out how to live that yet, but I thought it was important that someone did." He absorbed this. "Did you figure it out?" "Still working on it," she said. "Ask me after the debrief." Something in his face moved, the closest thing to a full, unguarded expression she'd seen there in years. And then he nodded once, the nod of someone accepting both the answer and the implication of it. And he went with the extraction team, and the vehicles moved through the gate, and the New Mexico night absorbed them as it absorbed everything. Garrison Webb was arrested at 6:40 a.m. at his residence in Northern Virginia by a joint team operating under a federal warrant that had been processed through a channel specifically constructed to bypass every institutional pathway he'd ever controlled. The warrant cited 11 months of documented intelligence transfer to a foreign-affiliated criminal network, abuse of classified access, obstruction of multiple ongoing federal operations, and the knowing endangerment of intelligence assets in the field. He was informed of the charges in his kitchen, in his bathrobe, holding a cup of coffee that he set down very carefully on the counter before he said anything. What he said was his attorney's name, which was his right and his only remaining one that mattered, and then he was silent. The agents who processed him noted that he didn't appear surprised. He appeared, one of them would later write in his incident report, like a man who had known this room was coming for a long time and had simply kept walking toward it because stopping wasn't in his character. The document that formed the primary basis of the warrant ran to 412 pages. It had been built over 14 months in complete isolation by a man in a research facility in New Mexico who had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure it was unimpeachable, and it was. Every transaction, every communication, every asset movement, every meridian directive that had passed through Webb's channel was documented with the precision of someone who understood that the case needed to be so complete that no institutional complexity, no lawyer, and no legacy of professional service could obscure it. By noon of the same day, 9 additional arrests had been made across 3 countries. The Meridian Network's operational tier, the command structure that had survived the Frosthaven insertion's failure and had been running contingency protocols for 4 days, collapsed in the way that things collapsed when the intelligence supporting them was total and the exposure was simultaneous. Not gradually, not with the prolonged unraveling of organizations that still had functional hiding places. All at once, like a structure that had been load-bearing on a single compromised pillar and had finally lost it. Deputy Director Sylvia Crane was briefed at 7:15 a.m., 45 minutes after Webb's arrest. The briefing was conducted by Fosse personally in a room that had been swept twice for surveillance, and it lasted 2 hours and was, by all accounts, one of the more difficult conversations either of them had conducted in careers built substantially on difficult conversations. She was angry. Fosse had predicted this and was correct. She was angry at the parallel architecture that had been built around her without her knowledge, angry at the months of her operational directives running through a compromised channel without her awareness, angry at the containment directive she'd issued based on incomplete information that would have dismantled the operation from the inside if it had been executed. She was angry with the specific, focused quality of a highly competent person confronting the limits of what even high competence can protect against when the compromise is deep enough and close enough. She was also, Fosse noted, processing all of it with the same steady honesty she brought to everything. The anger didn't obscure the analysis. She asked the right questions in the right order, absorbed the answers without retreating from them, and by the end of the 2 hours had moved from the emotional reckoning to the operational one. What needed to be corrected, what needed to be rebuilt, and what had survived intact despite everything. "Quinn," she said near the end of the briefing. Quinn held the operation together from Frosthaven forward, Fosse said. Every critical juncture, including last night. Crane was quiet for a moment. Her containment directive. Never executed. Because she made a different call. Because she made the right call, Fosse said carefully, based on information she gathered on the ground that wasn't available through standard channels. He paused. She flagged the anomaly. She held her position. She verified what needed to be verified before acting. He looked at Crane steadily. She did what we train assets to do when the chain of command is compromised. She trusted herself. Crane absorbed this. I need to talk to her. She's at Kestrel Ridge until this afternoon. She insisted on completing her patient discharges. A beat. Of course she did, Crane said, and in her voice was something that moved through the register of professional assessment and arrived somewhere adjacent to something warmer. She didn't name it. She didn't need to. Ava discharged Elliot Vance at 9:15 a.m. with a written monitoring protocol, a clear explanation of what he'd been exposed to and what the recovery timeline looked like, and the specific thoroughness she gave every patient because they were her patients and they deserved thoroughness. Vance shook her hand and thanked her and said something about how Kestrel Ridge was lucky to have her, and she received this with the same clean simplicity she always received things that were genuine. Carla Dine left at 10:40 a.m., similarly discharged, similarly documented, with a recommendation for a follow-up blood panel in 2 weeks that Ava wrote out with the careful precision of a clinician who understood that the medical responsibility didn't end at the facility door. Gerald Park came to find her afterward. He stood in the medical wing with the expression of a man who had spent the morning being briefed by federal officials and was now standing in the place where the person most responsible for his facility's survival was filling out a discharge summary. I've been asked not to discuss the specifics, he said. That's correct, she said, without looking up. I was told that a significant intelligence operation was concluded here last night and that my staff and my facility were protected throughout. Also correct. He was quiet for a moment. You've been here 4 days? Yes. And in 4 days you managed a chemical exposure incident, preserved the integrity of a classified transmission, and apparently physically detained an armed intruder in my medical wing. She put the discharge summary in the completed file and looked up at him. The medical wing was the most defensible position in the building, she said. It was a practical choice. Park looked at her for a long moment. The expression he wore was difficult to categorize. Not quite admiration, not quite bewilderment, something that lived in the territory between the two. The expression of a man genuinely revising his understanding of what people were capable of. Meta says you're the best nurse she's worked with in 6 years, he said. Meta is an excellent physician. She also says you're going to be leaving this afternoon. He nodded slowly. He seemed to want to say something more, and to be finding, as people often found with her, that the conventional language for what he wanted to express didn't quite fit. He settled on, thank you. He said it without ceremony, without performance, just the direct human expression of someone who understood that the words were insufficient and meant them anyway. You run a good facility, Gerald, she said, and used his first name deliberately because she'd been his employee for 4 days and he'd trusted her without the information that would have explained why trust was warranted, and that deserved acknowledgement. Your people are good. Take care of them. He nodded once more and left, and she finished her paperwork. Crane arrived at Kestrel Ridge at 1:20 p.m. in a vehicle with no markings and a driver who stayed with the car. She came into the medical wing where Ava was completing the last of the operational documentation, the version that went to Fosse's channel, thorough and classified, and nothing like the incident reports that would live in Kestrel Ridge's institutional record. They sat across from each other at the nursing station, and it was the first time they'd been in the same room since the morning after Frosthaven, when Crane had stood in a blizzard-stripped medical center and briefed angry Marines about operations they hadn't known they were part of. Crane looked at her for a long moment before she spoke. "The containment directive." "I didn't execute it," Ava said. "I know." Fosse explained the reasons. Crane's voice was measured, carrying the weight of a woman who had spent the morning doing difficult accounting and was presenting the results. "He was right that I would have initiated standard notification protocol, which would have reached Webb." A pause. "Which means your decision not to execute was the correct one." "It was a judgment call made on incomplete information," Ava said. "That's not the same as being correct." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Crane said. "In this work, the cases where they're the same thing are the ones that matter most." She looked at her steadily. "I'm not reprimanding you, Quinn. I'm acknowledging that you held an operation together under conditions that I didn't have full visibility on, and that the outcome was the best possible one." A beat. "I also want you to know that I don't enjoy being the last person in a room to understand what the room contains." "I know," Ava said. "I'm sorry for that part specifically." "Don't be sorry for the part you didn't control." Crane's voice was careful, but not unkind. "Be sorry for the parts you did, if any of them deserve it. In this case, I don't think they do." They looked at each other across the nursing station desk, and the specific quality of the silence between them was the silence of two people who operated at the same level, with the same seriousness, and were, for the first time, fully in the same picture. "Webb," Ava said. "In custody. Federal prosecution timeline is about 18 months, based on the volume of the documentation Hale's transmission provided. The case is airtight. His lawyers know it. He knows it." Crane paused. "He'll have time to think about what he chose." "His off-book assets?" "Prater and the other two are collected. The network he built outside the program is being mapped and dismantled. It'll take a few weeks to complete, but the operational capacity is gone." She paused. "He spent 11 years building institutional influence and 11 months building the thing that destroyed it. Most of that destruction came from 14 months of one person's work in a research facility in New Mexico." A pause. "And the last 24 hours of yours?" Ava said nothing. "Hale's debrief is already producing operational intelligence on Meridian threads we hadn't located," Crane continued. "The global arrests this morning were the first wave. There'll be more." She looked at her hands briefly, then back up. "His record is being fully corrected and restored. His voluntary separation documentation will be expunged and replaced with a classified commendation at the highest tier currently available." She paused. "Yours will be updated as well." "I don't need, It's not about need," Crane said, with the quiet firmness of someone drawing a line they've decided on. "It's about accuracy. The record should reflect what actually happened. What you actually did." Her voice carried something that was beyond professional assessment, a weight that came from spending a career in a world that consumed people quietly and was trying, in this specific moment, to do something different. Frosthaven, the Dolan situation, Kestrel Ridge, all of it, on the record, accurately, at the level it deserves. Ava was quiet for a moment. The thing that moved through her was not pride. She'd learned to route around pride as a variable a long time ago. But something older and less managed, the thing that happened when work you'd done alone, in silence, without recognition or witness, was finally seen by someone with the authority to name it correctly. "Thank you," she said. Crane nodded. "Fosse wants to talk about next assignment." "I know." "Do you have a preference?" Ava looked at the medical wing around her, the clean lines of it, the particular smell of antiseptic and fresh linen, the nursing station with its organized charts and its institutional lighting and its fundamental purpose of keeping people alive and attended to. She looked at it the way you looked at a place you were about to leave, taking its specific quality into the portable memory that traveled with you. "Tell him I need a week," she said. Crane blinked. the micro-expression of someone who had not expected that answer from this person. "A week," Ava said. "Not a debrief, not a transit, not a briefing room. A week where I am not any version of anybody that I've been constructed to be." She paused. "I think I've earned it." Crane looked at her, and something in her expression completed, a full assessment arriving at a full conclusion. "You've earned considerably more than a week," she said, "but a week is a start." She stood. "I'll tell him." She moved toward the exit and stopped with her hand on the door frame, a habit Ava had apparently made contagious. "Quinn?" Ava looked at her. "The Marines at Frosthaven," Crane said. "Webb's namesake, Lieutenant Webb. He filed a formal commendation for you, through proper channels, under his own name, citing specific actions during the incursion." She paused. "It arrived at my desk the same morning I was being briefed on Webb's arrest. I thought you should know." Ava absorbed this. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 23-year Marine who had stood in a blizzard corridor and been angry at having his facility used as bait, and who had then taken the time, through proper channels, under his own name, to put on record what he'd seen. "He's a good officer," she said. "Yes," Crane agreed. "He is." She opened the door. "1 week, Quinn. I mean it." She left, and the medical wing was quiet, and Ava Quinn sat at the nursing station in the long afternoon light of a New Mexico winter. And let the silence be what it was, not the silence of waiting, not the silence of operational pause, but the silence of something completed, every thread resolved, every account settled. The shape of the work, from the first blizzard alarm at Frosthaven to Cole Prater on this floor, at 1 a.m, assembled in her mind as the complete thing it had been from the beginning, even when she'd only been able to see pieces of it. She thought about Briggs in his hospital bed, straightening up in the corridor without knowing why. She thought about Greta Solis saying you're a strange person to have around as a compliment. She thought about Vance asking if it was bad, and her saying it's treatable and meaning it on every level simultaneously. She thought about Meta saying be careful to a nurse checking on a corridor situation, because she'd been paying attention for 4 days and had seen what was actually there. She thought about Marcus Hale on a rooftop in Vienna saying the work chooses you or it doesn't, and the thing she'd said in response that had taken 3 years and a transmission and a very long night to fully close. She thought about what she'd said to him in the medical wing at 1 a.m. "I want the work to matter. Most nights it does. That's enough." She held that for a moment, tested its weight, found it accurate, and found it something else too. Found it a beginning rather than a ceiling, the kind of true thing that contained room for expansion. Because most nights wasn't all nights, and all nights wasn't the goal, but the possibility of it was worth carrying. She finished the last of the operational documentation. She filed it. She stood, looked around the medical wing one final time, and turned off the nursing station lamp. Outside, the New Mexico sky was doing what New Mexico skies did in the late afternoon of winter, turning enormous shades of orange and red and a deep indigo at the eastern edge that looked like the opening of something rather than the close of it. She stood at the facility entrance and looked at it for a moment, not because she was in a cinematic pause of reflection, but because she'd been inside for 4 days and the sky was genuinely extraordinary, and she was a person who, when she had a moment to look at something extraordinary, looked at it. A week, not a mission, not a debrief, not a transit manifest. A week in a city of her choosing, as a person of her own construction, with no file to match and no cover to maintain, and nowhere she needed to be by a specific time for a classified reason. She thought about the ocean. She'd spent most of her operational career inland, Alaskan tundra, desert facilities, the middle of things. The ocean had no strategic value in most of what she did, and therefore she hadn't been near it in 2 years. 2 years was long enough. She picked up her bag, the single compact bag that contained everything she traveled with, which was not much because she'd learned to move light and had eventually stopped missing the things she'd left behind. And she walked to the vehicle that was waiting to take her to the transit hub, and she got in, and the facility got smaller behind her in the way facilities always got smaller, becoming a point and then a memory with coordinates. Her phone showed one message from a number she now had saved. Record corrected. Commendation filed. Rest well, Quinn. Crane. She put the phone in her bag. The road to the transit hub ran through open desert, flat and wide and honest, the kind of landscape that showed you everything it contained and hid nothing. She watched it move past the window with the clean, present attention of someone who was, for the first time in several days, not running any operational calculations at all. Just a person in a vehicle watching the desert, on her way to somewhere without a mission, carrying the knowledge of what she'd done and the weight of what it had cost, and the full, clear understanding that both of those things were hers and no one could reduce either of them. The people who had looked at her and seen nothing worth noting, they were alive because of that nothing. The Marines who had tried to get her out of the corridor, the contractors who had expected a nurse to be a delay, the network that had built a file around her invisibility and called it due diligence, all of them had made the same fundamental error. They had looked at someone quiet and decided quiet meant harmless, had looked at someone patient and decided patient meant passive, had looked at someone who did their work without announcement and decided the absence of announcement meant the absence of significance. The road kept moving. The sky kept changing. Somewhere in a federal facility in Virginia, Garrison Webb was beginning to understand the full shape of what had been built against him by the people he'd dismissed and outmaneuvered and moved across the board as expendable pieces. Somewhere in a debrief room, Marcus Hale was telling his story to people who had the clearance and the responsibility to hear it, and the story was being documented with the accuracy it deserved, and his name was being restored to itself. Somewhere in Alaska, a Marine lieutenant who had been angry about being used as bait had filed a commendation because he was a man who believed the record should reflect what actually happened. The record would reflect it, all of it, every quiet action in every unwitnessed corridor, every decision made alone in the dark, every life preserved by the work of someone who had never required the work to be visible in order to do it. The vehicle pulled onto the highway and the facility disappeared entirely behind the horizon, and Ava Quinn sat in the back seat with her bag on her lap and the window down just enough to let the cold desert air move through, and she let herself be, for a moment, simply the person at the end of a thing that was finished, not defined by it, not diminished by the fact that most of the world would never know it had happened, not waiting for the next thing to give the current one its meaning. The meaning was already there. It had been there from the beginning, in every room where someone had looked past her, in every dismissal that had become an operational advantage, in every moment of underestimation that she had transformed, quietly and completely, into the architecture of everything that came after. The quiet ones weren't waiting to be discovered. They were already doing the work.